Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. Let's rewind to a crisp autumn morning in late October. The air was cool enough to bite, but carried the kind of clarity that makes you feel alive. I remember the sun was just beginning to pierce through the thin fog that lingered over the valley. It was the kind of morning where the world felt still, like nature was holding its breath. I had decided to take some time for myself, a break from the noise of everyday life. My name's Eric, and hiking had always been my escape. Just me, my backpack, and the endless trails. That weekend, I was headed to the Silver Ridge Wilderness. It wasn't far from where I grew up, but its sprawling forest had always felt a world away from the familiarity of small-town life. I'd planned this solo trip for weeks. Between my day job at the hardware store and helping my parents manage their old farmhouse, I hadn't had much time to myself. My parents kept asking why I didn't just invite someone to join me, but solitude was the whole point. Being alone in the woods always felt like pressing the reset button on life. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows through the towering pines. There were a few cars parked nearby, but the place wasn't crowded. I remember seeing an older couple with trekking poles walking ahead, and a younger guy with a massive camera slung over his shoulder. We exchanged polite nods before going our separate ways. My route was a 12-mile loop that wound its way through dense forest, across small creeks, and up to a rocky overlook known as Raven's Peak. The plan was simple: hike up, camp near the summit, and head back down the next day. My pack was loaded with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, a portable stove, and enough food to last me the weekend. The first few miles of the trail were uneventful. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots, and the forest seemed to hum with life. Squirrels darted between trees, and every so often I'd hear the distant drumming of a woodpecker. I passed a small wooden sign that read Raven's Peak Trail and took the left fork, feeling a little thrill of excitement. The climb was steady but manageable. Every now and then, I'd stop to catch my breath and take in the scenery. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of oranges, yellows, and greens. There was something calming about being surrounded by so much untouched wilderness. Around noon, I stopped for lunch by a small creek. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom, scattered like forgotten coins. I pulled out a peanut butter sandwich, took a swig from my water bottle, and just sat there, letting the sound of the babbling stream wash over me. It was perfect. I started back on the trail feeling refreshed. The incline grew steeper, and the trees became denser. The afternoon sun cast long, shifting shadows, and the temperature began to drop. I had a feeling I was getting close to the overlook. I was looking forward to setting up camp and settling in for the night. By late afternoon, I reached Raven's Peak. The view was every bit as breathtaking as I'd hoped. The forest stretched out below me like a living map, with the horizon painted in hues of gold and crimson. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, anchored it securely, and unpacked my gear. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature fell fast. I pulled on a heavy sweater and started up my portable stove to heat some soup. Sitting by the tent, spoon in hand, I felt a deep sense of peace. The world felt far away, reduced to nothing more than the sound of the wind rustling the trees and the faint calls of birds preparing to roost. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and turned off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that presses in from all sides. I wasn't worried, though this was the solitude I'd been craving. That night, as I lay in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest, everything felt ordinary, normal, peaceful. I couldn't have known that by morning, everything would change. The morning came quietly, and at first, everything seemed normal. I woke to the sound of birds chirping faintly in the distance, a light breeze rustling the nylon of my tent. The crisp morning air seeped into my sleeping bag, urging me to get up and get moving. My breath hung in the air, visible in the cool dawn. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, stretching my arms as I took in the view. The valley below was shrouded in a soft mist that glowed faintly under the rising sun. It was serene, almost like stepping into a painting. I brewed a quick cup of coffee using my small portable stove and warmed my hands on the metal cup. As I packed up my camp, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet from where my tent was pitched, I saw a small pile of rocks that hadn't been there the night before. They weren't scattered naturally. These stones were deliberately stacked, forming a little tower about 2 feet high. I froze for a moment, staring at the pile. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to build cairns to mark trails, but this was different. The rocks were smooth and clean, like they'd been picked carefully, and I was certain they hadn't been there the day before. Trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it yesterday, or maybe another hiker had come through while I was sleeping. The thought of someone walking so close to my tent in the middle of the night unsettled me, but I pushed it aside. As I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I couldn't help glancing back at the rock pile every few steps. It just sat there, silent and unmoving, yet it seemed to pull at my attention. The hike down from Raven's Peak was supposed to be straightforward. I'd follow the same path I'd come up, making my way back to the trailhead by mid-afternoon. But as I walked, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The trees seemed denser somehow, their trunks pressing closer together. The trail, which had been well marked and clear on my way up, now felt narrower, almost overgrown in places. Fallen leaves covered the path, making it hard to see where I was stepping. I chalked it up to my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. I kept walking, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call overhead. But the strange feeling didn't go away. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something else: absolute silence. The forest, usually alive with sounds of wildlife, had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling, not even the distant hum of insects. It was as if the world around me had been muted. The absence of sound was unsettling. I stopped walking, straining my ears for any noise, but all I heard was the faint whisper of wind through the trees. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I told myself to keep moving. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, they blended in with the scattered leaves on the trail, but as I kept walking, they became more distinct. They were boot prints, similar to my own, but larger. They looked fresh, the edges of the impressions still crisp in the damp soil. I stopped and crouched down to examine them. The prints weren't going in the same direction as mine, they were heading toward me. It was as if someone had walked this trail recently, moving uphill while I was coming down. My heart started to race. The thought of someone else being out here wasn't inherently strange, but the timing felt off. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since I started descending. I stood up quickly, scanning the forest around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I kept walking, my pace a little faster now. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe the person had passed by earlier in the morning, before I woke up. That had to be it. But the prints didn't stop. They continued along the trail, always heading in my direction. At one point, I noticed they veered off into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I paused again, staring at the point where the trail met the forest, half expecting someone to emerge. But the woods remained still. I considered calling out, but something about the silence held me back. It was as if the forest itself was warning me to stay quiet. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable now. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow seemed amplified, as though the forest was alive and watching. I pressed on, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever or whoever was out here. After another hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree and taking a long drink from my water bottle. For a moment, the unease began to fade. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the ground. But then I saw it. In the middle of the clearing was another pile of rocks, identical to the one I'd seen near my campsite. Same size, same careful arrangement. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way I could have missed this on my way up yesterday. Panic started to set in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, or worse, led. The footprints, the silence, the rocks. It all felt deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to send a message. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Adjusting my pack, I pushed forward, my pace quickening. The sooner I got out of these woods, the better. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the shadows growing longer despite the midday sun. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. As I continued down the path, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. My steps quickened, and each sound from the forest seemed louder, sharper. The crack of a twig underfoot, the rustle of wind in the trees, every noise echoed in my mind like a warning. I glanced over my shoulder more often now, but saw nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. But I couldn't rid myself of the unsettling sensation that someone or something was walking behind me, just out of sight. It was then that I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the woods. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, it became unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They were too close, too deliberate. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the dense, silent forest. The same trees, the same shadows. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the tension in my chest remained. The footsteps stopped when I did. When I started walking again, they resumed. I couldn't explain it. No one else was around. I was alone. I pushed forward, my mind racing. Could it be an animal? A bear or something larger? But the rhythm of the steps, the way they seemed to mimic mine, didn't fit. It wasn't the shuffle of paws or the uneven stride of an animal. It was human. But there was no one. The trail began to narrow again, the trees pressing closer together, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the woods, and the silence, if possible, became even more profound. It felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath, watching, waiting. Then, ahead of me, I saw it. Another pile of rocks. This one was larger, built up in a loose pyramid, almost as if it were meant to be seen from a distance. But it wasn't the size of the pile that caught my attention. It was the way it seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light, an unnatural shimmer that I couldn't explain. I approached it cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't right. The rocks were too clean, too deliberate. Someone or something had arranged them with intention. I crouched down to examine the pile more closely. The ground around it was undisturbed, the soil untouched. It didn't make sense. How could something so large have been placed here without leaving any sign of effort? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The silence was overwhelming now, the air thick with something unspoken. I stood up quickly, almost knocking over the stack of rocks in my haste to leave. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was so faint at first, I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like something prowling in the shadows. The growl wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. It was deep, almost inhuman. A sound that sent a chill through my entire body. I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. There was nothing. Just trees. But the growl had been real. I could feel it in my bones, reverberating in the air. I started walking faster, My steps hurried but controlled. I had to get out of here. My instincts told me to keep moving, to ignore the fear gnawing at my insides. But the closer I got to the trailhead, the more intense the sense of something being wrong became. The growling continued, now accompanied by a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. The sound was closing in, creeping ever closer, yet I couldn't see a thing. I quickened my pace, nearly running now. The forest felt like it was closing in on me. The trees were so thick that I could barely make out the trail ahead. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and twitch, like the forest itself was alive. That's when I saw it. A figure. It stood at the edge of the trail, just at the point where the trees began to thin out. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, perhaps. But then it moved. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretching at odd angles, almost as if it didn't belong to the human form. It wasn't clear what it was, just a shape, darker than the surrounding trees. But there was no mistaking it. It was there, watching me. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, everything went still. The air was thick with tension, the forest holding its breath. Then, the figure shifted. It wasn't quick, but it was smooth, almost gliding. It moved to the side of the trail, its long arms extending as if to reach for me. I couldn't see its face, but the movement itself was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about my pack or the gear I'd left behind. All I could think about was getting away from whatever that thing was. The growling started again, louder now, closer. The sound seemed to echo in every direction, but I couldn't look back. My feet hit the ground harder, faster. The trees blurred past me, their bark scraping against my skin as I pushed through the underbrush. The path was almost gone now, swallowed by the dense woods around me. But I kept running. I couldn't stop. And then, as I stumbled over a rock, I saw it, the trailhead. I didn't stop to catch my breath or gather my thoughts. I just ran. The moment I broke through the trees and onto the open road, I didn't dare look back. My legs were burning, my heart pounding in my chest, but I kept moving. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where the first signs of civilization made my legs buckle. I collapsed on the asphalt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sun had set, and the woods beyond were shrouded in complete darkness. I was safe, but something in me knew that the forest hadn't let me go completely. Something had followed me out, something I couldn't explain. I had no intention of ever going back to those woods. I sat there on the asphalt, trembling, my chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. The weight of what had just happened was crushing me. The woods were behind me now, the unknown darkness still clinging to my skin, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure, tall, unnatural, its arms stretching toward me in a way no human could. The growls still echoed in my mind, reverberating through the quiet of the night, each one more disturbing than the last. But something else was creeping up on me, something worse. I couldn't remember when exactly the feeling had shifted. I had been so focused on the fear, the overwhelming panic, that I had failed to notice the one thing that was still wrong. The feeling that, despite everything, I wasn't truly alone. It wasn't just the woods that had followed me. The moment I had arrived back at the parking lot, there had been a noise. Something subtle. A crack of branches snapping in the distance, too deliberate to be the wind. I didn't want to believe it, but as I tried to gather myself, I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder, back toward the dark outline of the trees. I should have known then, but the parking lot was supposed to be safe. The asphalt, the open space, it was all supposed to be a boundary, a place of escape. Then the ground beneath me vibrated. A faint tremor at first, like distant footsteps, but gradually growing stronger until it became undeniable. The whole lot shuddered, as if the earth itself was being disturbed. I stood, wide-eyed, my feet frozen in place as the tremor grew more intense. It felt like the ground was pulsing, alive with something ancient. My breath hitched. I didn't know what was happening. What was going on? Was it an earthquake? No, it didn't feel like one. This wasn't something natural. Then I heard it, the growl. It was louder now, no longer distant, no longer a low rumble in the woods. It was in the parking lot. Close, too close. My stomach twisted and the hairs on my neck stood up. My pulse was racing. There was no way in hell that thing had made it out of the woods. But it was here, with me now, in this empty lot, with the cold air hanging heavy between us. I turned to face the sound, my legs shaking beneath me as the growl rose in pitch, becoming something almost inhuman. It wasn't the growl of a wild animal anymore. It was something darker, something deeper. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape creeping along the edge of the lot, just beyond the flickering streetlight. But then the shape grew clearer, more defined, until it fully emerged into view. The figure I had seen in the woods was standing in front of me, taller than before, its limbs stretched in grotesque angles, moving with unnatural precision. It was as if it was no longer bound by the laws of the world I understood. It wasn't human, it couldn't be. But there it was, standing in the middle of the parking lot, the very air around it crackling with a palpable tension. It was as though the world had turned on its axis. Everything I had known, everything I had taken for granted about this place, about safety, had crumbled in an instant. My heart thundered in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. "Soothe, what are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. The creature didn't respond, its black, hollow eyes staring into mine. The growl continued, a rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within its chest. It was the sound of pure malice. And then the creature shifted. It moved towards me with alarming speed, its limbs twisting unnaturally. It was coming for me. I could see it now, the sharp, jagged outline of its figure in the dim light. Its skin, if you could even call it, that seemed to ripple and shift, like something crawling under the surface, something that didn't belong in the world. I gasped, stumbling backward, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing that wasn't human was approaching me, and I was powerless to stop it. In that moment, I finally understood. It wasn't just following me. It had been waiting for me. The shadow, it wasn't the only one. More shapes began to emerge from the darkness. More of them, taller, thinner figures, each one more grotesque than the last, until the entire parking lot was filled with these creatures. I was surrounded, trapped. My body surged with adrenaline, and finally, instincts kicked in. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. All I could see was the road ahead, the dim lights of the street. But I wasn't going to make it. The creatures were too close now. I could feel their presence, their reach. I could almost taste the air as it grew thicker, heavier, as if the entire world was suffocating me. And then I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just knew that whatever was happening, whatever had been following me, was going to take me. And there was no escape. I should have screamed, but no sound came out. I should have fought back, but there was nothing in me that felt strong enough. Instead, I felt like a puppet, helpless, caught in the hands of something far older, far more powerful than anything I had ever known. The creatures were still circling, but their growls had softened. The air was thick with their presence, but the noise faded into an eerie silence that settled deep into my bones. And then I heard something else. A voice. It wasn't human either. It wasn't even a whisper or a growl. It was like a distant murmur, a hollow, echoing voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't speaking to me directly, but I could feel the words inside my head, sinking into my mind like a curse. Not yet. The grip on my shoulder loosened, and for a moment I thought it was over. I thought I might escape, that I was free. But when I turned around, I didn't see the creature anymore. It was as if the world itself had swallowed it whole, erased it from existence in the blink of an eye. But the presence remained. My heart was still hammering in my chest as I stood there in the middle of the parking lot. The road in front of me was a blur, my surroundings completely alien, and yet the chill in the air was something I recognized. It was that same unnatural cold. It was suffocating, but it wasn't just in the air. It was inside me too. I didn't know what had just happened. Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. Everything felt too real, too intense, too overwhelming to be a product of my mind. And yet, everything I thought I knew about reality seemed to be slipping through my fingers like sand. There was no explanation for what I had seen, for what I had felt. Nothing about the experience made sense. The things I had encountered weren't just creatures. They were something different, something that didn't belong. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I needed to get away from the parking lot, away from the woods, away from that thing that had almost consumed me. I didn't care if I was running into more danger. I just needed to escape. As I reached the end of the lot, a sense of finality hit me. I was standing at the edge of the forest, the trees looming in the distance, dark and imposing. But there was no turning back now. I wasn't just trying to escape the creatures I had seen. I was running from the knowledge that the world was much more complicated than I had ever believed. I kept walking, further and further away from the woods, away from the unknown. But the thoughts kept haunting me. They echoed through my mind with each step I took, louder and louder. What were they? Why did they let me go? Were they watching me now? I tried to block out the thoughts, to push them away, but they only grew stronger. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the memories of the dark figures, the strange, whispering voice that had filled my mind. When I finally reached the edge of the town, the tension in my body loosened just slightly. I wasn't sure how far I had walked, but I knew I was far enough. Far enough from the woods, at least. Far enough from those creatures. Or was I? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me, lingering just beyond the edge of my perception. Something was out there, waiting. And no matter how far I ran, I would never truly escape it. The night stretched on, and as I walked into the quiet streets of the town, the terror inside me didn't fade. It would never fade. It's strange, isn't it? How you can live your life thinking that everything is just as it seems, believing that the world is a simple place, bound by rules and logic. And then something happens, something so terrifying, so inexplicable, that it shakes your understanding of reality to its very core. The woods did that to me. They tore apart the fabric of everything I thought I knew, revealing a darkness that I can't ignore, a darkness that I can never fully escape. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. The air is too still, the shadows too thick. I glance over my shoulder, but there's nothing there. Nothing, except the eerie quiet of a night that's gone on too long. But that doesn't mean I'm free. I don't sleep well anymore. Even when I'm in the comfort of my own home, I can feel the presence of those things hovering just outside of my awareness. The sounds at night are sharper, too loud, too close. The trees that line the streets no longer seem like simple, peaceful giants, but like looming figures, watching and waiting. I've tried to tell others, to explain what happened, but it's impossible. How can you make someone understand a terror so deep, so unfathomable, that it completely undoes their understanding of reality? They would never believe me. And maybe that's the worst part, that I'm left alone with this knowledge, this terrible truth that there are things in the world beyond what we can see. Things that follow us, that wait for the right moment to make themselves known. But I'll never forget what I saw, what I felt. Those creatures, those voices, the weight of the dark forest, it all comes rushing back every time I close my eyes, every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can hear a distant murmur, like a faint whisper just out of reach. Not yet. What did that mean? Who or what was saying it? The woods may be miles away, but they are still in my mind, still in my nightmares. Every step I take, I wonder if I'm being followed. If it's only a matter of time before I'm pulled back into that twisted realm where reality and terror blend into one. The worst part is that I don't even know what they wanted. The creatures, the voice, the presence that seemed to surround me, it's all a mystery. An unsolvable puzzle. And no matter how far I run, I can never seem to outrun the questions, the fear, the uncertainty. I've gone over every detail of that night in my mind 100 times, trying to find some explanation, some sign that I missed. But nothing makes sense. It was like the woods themselves were alive, and whatever waited in their depths was playing a game with rules I couldn't understand. And when I broke those rules, I paid the price. I have to live with that now. I have to live with the knowledge that something is out there, something that defies logic, that doesn't belong to this world. It waits, patient and silent, knowing that one day it will find its way back into my life. Into anyone's life who dares to venture too close. Some might call me paranoid. Some might say I've just experienced something that's all in my head. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And as long as I live, I'll never forget the way the trees whispered at the edge of the woods, the way the darkness stretched just a little too far. In the end, we all want to believe that the world is safe, that the things we fear are just stories, just our imagination. But the woods proved otherwise. And now, no matter how many days go by, how many miles I put between myself and that place, I will always be looking over my shoulder. Because I know the truth now. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I made the decision that would change everything. The kind of evening that felt like any other. Quiet, calm, and almost too ordinary for anyone to notice. It wasn't the kind of evening that would leave anyone with a sense of dread or foreboding. Yet, looking back, I realized that's exactly when the shift happened. The seemingly uneventful evening that marked the beginning of a series of unsettling events. Let me introduce myself. My name is Mark. I'm an urban explorer, someone who spends their weekends and evenings venturing into forgotten places, old buildings, abandoned factories, and yes, even hospitals. The thrill of exploring somewhere that hasn't been touched by modern civilization in years is something that has always fascinated me. These buildings, full of history and mystery, have always called to me. But as much as I've explored, I'd never faced anything like this before. It was a few days before I found myself standing outside the crumbling brick facade of an old hospital. I had heard rumors about this place for years, but it had always felt out of reach. The building had been abandoned for decades, left to rot and decay in the middle of an overgrown forest. The windows were dark, the roof sagging under years of neglect. No one had stepped foot inside in who knows how long. But that's what made it so intriguing. The rumors had been inconsistent. Some people said the place was haunted by the spirits of former patients. Others said it was the site of some dark experiments carried out by the hospital staff. But rumors are just that, rumors. I wasn't the type to believe in such things. I was there for the adventure, the stories I could share with my friends later on. I didn't need to worry about ghosts or strange happenings. I just wanted to explore. I wasn't alone, of course. I had a few friends who shared my enthusiasm for the eerie, the strange, and the forgotten. There was Tom, a fellow urban explorer who had been with me on many of my past adventures. He had a knack for finding the most obscure places, the ones most people would steer clear of. Then there was Rachel, a photographer who had a passion for capturing the eerie beauty of decaying buildings. Together, the three of us had spent countless hours documenting the forgotten corners of our city and beyond. As I parked my car near the overgrown path leading to the hospital, I couldn't help but feel a strange pull in my chest. There was something different about this place, something unsettling in the air. But I pushed it aside, chalking it up to the anticipation of a new adventure. We stood there, staring at the looming building in front of us. It was even more imposing in person than in the pictures I had seen. The hospital was a massive structure with broken windows and peeling paint. The front door hung ajar, inviting us in. The eerie silence around us was the only sound, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like the building had been waiting for us, waiting for someone to venture inside. Without another word, we gathered our gear, flashlights, cameras, and a few tools before making our way to the entrance. The door creaked open, the sound reverberating in the quiet night. We stepped inside. The air inside the hospital was thick and musty, as if the building hadn't seen fresh air in years. The walls were covered in mildew, and the floors were slick with grime. But despite the decay, there was a certain beauty to the place. The rusted metal beds, the faded tiles, and the old medical equipment scattered around. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the hospital had been abandoned in the middle of something important. Tom immediately began setting up his camera, eager to document every corner of the hospital. Rachel started snapping photos, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was unnerving. There was something about the stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the typical silence of an abandoned building. It felt wrong. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, this wasn't the first abandoned place we had explored. We had been inside places far creepier than this. I had been in hospitals, asylums, and old prisons. But something about this place felt different. Maybe it was the sense that we were trespassing in a place that had been forgotten for a reason. We made our way through the hospital, exploring room after room. Each one seemed to tell a different story. In one room, we found old medical charts scattered across the floor, their contents illegible after years of neglect. In another, we discovered a set of old surgical tools, their rusted blades glinting in the beam of my flashlight. Despite the decay, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was a subtle sensation, but it was there. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the building's oppressive atmosphere getting to me. But as I moved deeper into the hospital, I began to notice things that didn't make sense. I remember walking down a long, narrow hallway when I first heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was almost like the soft shuffle of footsteps. But when I turned around, there was no one behind me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Tom and Rachel both stopped in their tracks and turned to look at me. They had heard it too. We all stood there for a moment, straining our ears to catch any other sounds. But the footsteps, if that's what they were, had stopped. "Probably just the building settling," Tom suggested, trying to brush it off. But even he seemed a little unsettled. I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. Something was off about this place. Something was waiting, lurking in the shadows. We pressed on, determined to see it all. We explored the basement, where the air was damp and cold. We found what looked like an old morgue, its stainless steel tables long rusted and forgotten. There was no sign of life, at least, no sign of living people. The sense that something wasn't quite right lingered in the back of my mind, but I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the nature of abandoned places. The stillness, the emptiness, these things often made the air feel heavy, like the building itself was watching us. It wasn't anything new. But that was when the first sign came. We were exploring what appeared to be a patient ward on the upper floor. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and the walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper, curling at the edges. There were broken windows, letting in the moonlight and casting eerie shadows across the room. It was so quiet that the sound of my own breathing felt amplified, like I was being suffocated by the silence itself. Tom had wandered off into a different room, and Rachel was taking photos of the remnants of what used to be a nurse's station. I was standing by the window, peering out at the overgrown yard outside when I noticed something strange. A figure! It was only for a moment, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart across the hall in the reflection of the window. It was too quick to be anyone from our group, and when I turned around, there was no one there. I froze, my heart suddenly racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The dim lighting, the oppressive atmosphere, it was easy to get paranoid. But that's when I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, like a door creaking open. I glanced at Rachel, who was still absorbed in her photography, and then at Tom, who had reappeared in the doorway to the next room. I started to walk toward him, wanting to ask if he'd heard anything, but before I could speak, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the nurse's station, just a few feet from where Rachel was standing, was slowly swinging open. I hadn't heard anyone approach it. No footsteps, no sound at all. It just moved. It was as if something or someone had pushed it open from the other side. My mind raced. Was it the wind? There were broken windows in the room, and I suppose a gust could have caused it to move, but the air inside the building felt still, stagnant. There was no breeze, nothing that could have caused it. I turned to Rachel, my voice barely a whisper. "Did you see that?" I asked, gesturing toward the door. She blinked at me, her camera still in her hands. "See what?" "The door. It just opened, on its own." She raised an eyebrow, then glanced over her shoulder toward the nurse's station. Her face was a mask of skepticism, but I could tell she was starting to feel uneasy. "No way," she muttered, half to herself, before walking toward the door. I followed her, my feet heavy as I stepped closer to the room. The door was hanging ajar now, revealing the cluttered mess inside. Old medical supplies, papers strewn across the floor, and broken furniture. It was all still, undisturbed. But that didn't explain how the door had opened. Rachel reached out and nudged the door with her hand, pushing it fully open. The motion caused a groan to echo through the hallway, as if the building itself was protest. I looked at her, expecting her to laugh it off, but she didn't. Her expression had changed. It was subtle, but I could see it in the way her eyes narrowed and her lips tightened. She was no longer focused on the door, but on something deeper, something unsettling in the air. "Let's just move on," she said softly, her voice suddenly quieter than before. I didn't need her to say it for me to know. There was a strange energy in that room, something almost suffocating. But instead of leaving, I glanced back toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, there was a flicker of movement. It was too quick to be human, too unnatural. It was like a shadow that slipped between the walls, something that shouldn't have been there. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Tom must have sensed something was off because he came up behind me, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You good, man?" he asked, voice low. He had been busy with his camera, but now he was looking at me with a hint of concern. "I saw something," I replied, still staring down the hallway. "Back there. A shadow." Tom's eyes followed mine, but whatever I had seen, it was gone now. The hallway was as empty as it had been moments before. "You sure?" she asked, sounding skeptical. "It's probably just the light playing tricks on you." "Maybe," I muttered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That whatever had been there had just slipped out of view. It wasn't the first time I'd had a strange experience in an abandoned building, but this was different. I didn't feel like it was my imagination. I felt like something was in there with us. Something that didn't belong. We decided to move on, heading down a different hallway that led to what looked like an old operating room. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel that we were being followed. Every footstep echoed, but there was a faint sense of unease in the air, as if the shadows themselves were inching closer with every step we took. I turned to look behind me again, but nothing was there. Just the long, empty hallway stretching into darkness. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it wasn't easy. The building was oppressive, its walls closing in around us with each step. It was then that Rachel stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her face pale as she glanced around, wide-eyed. Tom and I turned toward her, confusion written on our faces. "Hear what?" I asked. "I heard someone crying." Her voice wavered, her eyes darting nervously toward the walls. It was soft, like a child. A chill ran through me at her words. A child's cry? In a place like this? "I didn't hear anything," Tom said, trying to dismiss it. But I saw the unease creeping into his expression too. "Let's just get out of here," Rachel said, her voice firm now. She wasn't laughing it off anymore. She was serious. We all stood there for a moment, exchanging looks. It wasn't the first time we'd heard strange sounds in abandoned places, but this felt different. It felt real. I could see it in Rachel's face. The fear was evident, and it was starting to seep into me too. Still, we pressed on, deciding to investigate the sound. But as we moved further into the building, the sense of unease grew. The air was heavy, thick with the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from the shadows. The eerie sensation lingered in the pit of my stomach as we moved deeper into the hospital, and with each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What had started as a strange, almost comical flicker in the corner of my eye, a simple door that creaked open, was now a fully fledged nightmare that seemed to wrap itself tighter around us with every passing second. We moved through the abandoned halls cautiously, as if every shadow might hold something waiting for us. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay seeping from every corner. The once pristine tiles were now cracked and chipped, their surfaces grimy and covered in the residue of years of neglect. The flickering lights above us only added to the dismal atmosphere, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift when we weren't looking. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel them the eyes of the hospital. It was as though the building itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "All right, let's get this over with," Tom muttered under his breath, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He was just as shaken as the rest of us, though none of us would admit it out loud. Rachel was quieter than usual, her face pale and tense. She had barely spoken since the incident with the door, and her unease was beginning to infect me too. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened in this place, what had left such a palpable energy lingering in the walls. Something bad had happened here, something we were getting closer and closer to uncovering. We wandered down a narrow hallway that led us to what appeared to be an old storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The smell hit me first stale air, mixed with something faintly metallic, like the tang of rust. Inside, the room was lined with old equipment, some of it still covered in layers of dust, others half rotted and covered in mildew. But what caught my attention wasn't the equipment. It was a small, yellowed sheet of paper sticking out from beneath a pile of old medical records. I pulled it free, holding it up in the dim light. The handwriting was barely legible, but I could make out a few words. "Do not." The rest of the sentence was too faded to read. It was nothing, really, just a fragment, but something about it made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything, a loud bang echoed through the building, making me jump. It came from the far end of the hallway we had just walked down. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively grabbed Rachel's arm. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Tom, too, had heard it. "Yeah," he said, his voice unsteady. "Let's go check it out." The hallway stretched before us, dark and oppressive. Every step I took felt like it brought me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. As we reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door slightly cracked open. The sound had come from behind it. "Should we go in?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not going in alone," Tom replied firmly, but he too seemed hesitant. We all stood there for a moment, the tension thick between us. We could hear nothing now, just the steady thrum of our own heartbeats, echoing in the silence. Slowly, we pushed the door open, our eyes straining to adjust to the darkness inside. At first, I thought it was empty. A small room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. There were broken chairs, old files scattered across the floor, and a dusty desk covered in yellowed paperwork. But then I saw it. On the far wall, near the window, there was a smear of something dark, too dark to be dust, too slick to be anything natural. My eyes locked onto it, and I realized with a shock what I was seeing. Blood. Fresh blood. I froze, my body suddenly heavy with dread. Rachel gasped, stepping back as though the sight was too much for her to handle. Tom swore under his breath, taking a step forward to examine it more closely. I wanted to follow, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a sense of cold dread filling me from the inside out. "Who the hell did this?" Tom muttered, his voice shaking. He glanced around the room as if expecting to find someone hiding in the shadows. This isn't some prank. Someone's been here. We were no longer alone. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. We had walked into something much darker than we ever anticipated. I glanced over my shoulder nervously, half expecting to see a figure standing just behind us, watching us silently. But the room remained still, its silence more suffocating than ever. Then came the sound. At first, it was barely audible, like the faintest scratching, but it quickly grew louder, a relentless scraping that echoed through the room. It was coming from the far corner, where a rusted metal cabinet sat, its doors slightly ajar. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my steps quick and purposeful. The others followed, though I could see the fear in their eyes. The sound was almost maddening, like something was trying to escape from inside the cabinet. I reached for the door and yanked it open. Empty. Nothing. The noise stopped, and for a moment, the room was so silent it almost hurt. I turned to face Tom and Rachel, my mind racing. What had we just heard? What had caused it? Before I could say anything, the door slammed shut behind me, making us all jump. We spun around, expecting to see something or someone there, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. "I'm done," Rachel whispered, her voice tight with fear. She turned to leave, but I stopped her. "No, wait," I said, grabbing her arm. "Let's just get out of here. We've seen enough." But as we moved toward the door, I felt it. The weight of 1,000 eyes on my back. It was the kind of feeling that crawled beneath your skin, making your heart race in your chest. It was the unmistakable sense that we were being followed. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Rachel looked up, her face pale as she nodded slowly. The distant sound of footsteps was unmistakable. We weren't alone anymore. The last thing I heard before the doors slammed shut behind us was the soft sound of a whispering voice, too faint to understand, but unmistakably there. I glanced over at Rachel and Tom, both of their faces drained of color. Rachel's eyes were wide with terror, her hand gripping mine so tightly that it almost hurt. Tom was scanning the hallway, his expression unreadable, but I could see the fear in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. We had all reached the same conclusion. Whatever we were about to face, it was not going to be easy. Suddenly, the oppressive silence was broken by a low, groaning sound like a distant, muffled scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that didn't seem possible, something that shouldn't belong in a place as decayed and abandoned as this hospital. But there it was, undeniable and bone-chilling. I couldn't suppress a shiver as the noise grew louder, closer. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, the cold seeping through my clothes, turning my skin to ice. I could barely breathe as I looked around for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just empty walls and empty rooms, the shadows growing longer as the flickering lights overhead hummed with an almost ominous rhythm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, but this time it felt even heavier, more suffocating. We stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what had just happened, the air thick with the sensation that we weren't alone. Something had been here, something that wasn't human. Without warning, a door to our right creaked open, slowly, agonizingly slow, as if pushed by an unseen hand. I turned toward it instinctively, my heart leaping into my throat. The room beyond the door was bathed in an eerie, pale light, the kind that no light bulb should produce, and my eyes were drawn to it like a magnet. I don't know what possessed me to move, but something inside me urged me forward. Rachel grabbed my arm, but I shook her off, my steps heavy and deliberate as I approached the doorway. The others followed, though I could feel their hesitation, the way their eyes darted around as though expecting something to jump out at any moment. When I crossed the threshold into the room, the full extent of the horror hit me. The room was no longer just a room, it was a trap, a stage set for something unimaginable. The walls were covered in old bloodstains, yellowed and dark, streaked in unnatural patterns. I felt as though the very air had a weight to it, heavy with dread, thick with something ancient and evil. And then I saw it. Lying in the center of the room, illuminated by the strange light, was a figure. At first, it seemed like a mannequin, its body sprawled across the floor in an unnatural position. But as I took a step closer, the reality of it hit me, and my stomach turned. This wasn't some forgotten prop, it was a person, or it had been. The figure's skin was as pale as marble, stretched taut across its bones, and its eyes, wide open and glassy, stared straight at me, frozen in a state of pure terror. A single word escaped my lips, though I wasn't sure I even said it aloud. No. I could feel Rachel's breath against my neck as she gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Tom's eyes were wide, and for a moment, I thought he might be sick. But the figure on the floor wasn't the worst part. It was the shape that seemed to linger in the shadows behind it, a twisted silhouette that made no sense, like something that was not quite human, not quite animal. Something moved, and before I could react, the figure in the shadows lunged toward us, its body contorting in ways that no living being should be able to. The screech that came from it was inhuman, something between a growl and a cry, and it froze me in place. Tom's scream cut through the air, the sound raw and desperate, and we all scrambled backward, tripping over our own feet as we tried to flee. The lights above us flickered violently, casting the room into near darkness, and I could hear the thing moving, sliding, slithering toward us with sickening speed. But we weren't fast enough. The thing lunged at Rachel, its hands claws reaching out for her, and I reached out instinctively to pull her away. But I wasn't quick enough. She screamed, a sound that chilled me to the bone, as the creature's clawed fingers sank into her shoulder. It was like they were made of ice, cold and unnatural, and I could hear her cry out in pain as the creature dragged her toward the center of the room. I didn't think, I just reacted, grabbing Tom's arm and pulling him with me as we sprinted toward the door. Rachel's scream echoed in my ears, but we couldn't go back. I couldn't go back. We burst out of the room, and the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. I didn't stop running, even when we reached the end of the hall. We kept moving, fast and hard, until we reached the staircase and scrambled down the steps. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air, the night air cold against our sweat-drenched skin. But even as we ran, even as we made our escape, I knew in the pit of my stomach that it wasn't over. That thing, whatever it was still there, still lurking, waiting for the next person to wander in, to get too close. And it would wait for us too, as long as it had to. We were not safe. The night air was cold, stinging my lungs as I stumbled through the overgrown yard, heart hammering in my chest. I could hear Tom's labored breath behind me, matching mine in intensity, but neither of us dared to slow down. The only sounds that filled the silence were our footsteps and the distant howling of wind through the broken windows of the hospital. Rachel's screams still echoed in my ears, even though we were miles away from that place now. I could still hear her voice in my mind, the desperation and terror that had been in it as that thing grabbed her, but we couldn't go back. We couldn't help her. The thought of it weighed on me like a lead anchor, but it was the truth. We were lucky to escape with our lives. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. A cold presence seemed to trail behind us, something I couldn't explain but felt deep in my bones. I looked over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see the creature from the hospital chasing us, but every time there was nothing. Just the dark expanse of the woods, silent and still. When we reached the car, I almost collapsed with relief. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The image of that thing still burned into my mind. Tom and I barely spoke as we climbed into the car, the engine roaring to life as I tore out of the driveway, not looking back. We didn't speak at all for the rest of the drive. There was nothing to say. We had escaped barely, but the weight of what had happened pressed down on us, suffocating us with the knowledge that the terror wasn't over. Not really. We had left Rachel behind. She was still there, somewhere in that hospital with whatever that thing was. By the time we reached the safety of Tom's house, the adrenaline had started to wear off, and a deep, gnawing exhaustion set in. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept racing, flashing back to the hospital, to Rachel's scream, to the thing that had chased us. It was too much to process, too much to make sense of. Tom paced in front of me, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. I could tell that he was struggling just as much as I was to understand what had happened. "We have to go back," he finally said, his voice rough. The words hit me like a slap. "No," I replied sharply, shaking my head. "We can't. We barely made it out alive, Tom. You saw what happened." I stopped myself. The words caught in my throat. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew it was true. We left Rachel there, and I don't know if she's still alive. Tom looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from where he was gripping the edge of the table. He didn't respond at first, and I could see that he was wrestling with the same thoughts. He knew, deep down, that going back to that place was a death sentence. But we couldn't just forget about Rachel. Could we? A long silence stretched between us. The weight of the unknown hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Neither of us knew what to do. How could we resolve this? How could we go back and face the thing that nearly killed us? How could we even be sure that Rachel was still in danger? And if she was, what could we do to save her? The truth was, I didn't have an answer. We didn't have any answers. The whole situation was beyond anything I had ever imagined. I had always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or monsters or any of the things people claimed to have seen. But that night, in that hospital, I had seen something that defied all logic, all explanation. It was real, and it was still out there. After a while, Tom broke the silence again. "We should call the police." But even as he said it, I could tell he wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced either. The police wouldn't believe us. How could they? How could anyone believe a story like ours? The hospital had been abandoned for years. There was no record of any missing persons, no history of anything unusual happening there. If we went to the authorities with what we had seen, they would laugh us off as crazy. Maybe even lock us up for making up such an insane story. So we didn't call the police. Instead, we just sat there, the weight of the world pressing down on us. Time seemed to stretch on forever, the silence between us becoming unbearable. And all the while, my mind kept circling back to Rachel. I couldn't shake the image of her face, her terror, the way she had screamed as that thing dragged her away. I had to do something. But what? We never spoke about it again. Months passed, and life eventually went back to a semblance of normalcy. But nothing was the same. Not for me, anyway. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that figure in the hospital, the twisted thing that had chased us. I could still hear Rachel's scream echoing in my mind, and I knew I could never forget what I had seen, what we had left behind. Every now and then, I hear reports of strange occurrences near that old hospital. People talk about odd lights, eerie sounds, and the feeling of being watched. Some say they've seen figures in the windows at night, shadows moving where no one should be. But I try not to listen, try not to think about it. I haven't been back to that hospital. I don't plan on it. But the fear never leaves. The questions never fade. And I wonder every day if there's anyone else out there who has gone in looking for answers and never came back. Time has passed, and yet it feels as though I'm still there, standing in that decaying hospital, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of something watching me from the darkness. I can't explain it, but no matter how far I run, the memories of that place follow me, wrapping themselves around my mind like an iron chain. I've tried to move on, to convince myself that the horrors we encountered were just figments of our imagination, an overactive mind, perhaps fueled by fear, the feeling of being trapped in an abandoned building for too long. But the truth is, I can't shake the unsettling feeling that something is still out there, waiting. After that night, Tom and I went our separate ways. I couldn't stay in touch with him, and I think, deep down, he felt the same way. There was no point in speaking about what happened. It only dredged up feelings we didn't want to face. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the scars from that night went far deeper than just physical fear. It was something psychological, a seed planted in the very core of my being. The way my mind raced every time I heard a sound in the dark. The way I felt like I was being watched, even when I was alone in my own home. It was in the quietest moments that I felt it most, the sensation that the walls of my own house were closing in, that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. My thoughts would drift back to that hospital, to the cold, rotting walls, the suffocating darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. The thing we had encountered, what was it? What did it want from us? And most haunting of all, why did it spare us? I thought I had escaped it, but over the months, I came to understand that escape wasn't the same as truly leaving it behind. It wasn't the kind of terror that fades with time. It stays. It seeps into the corners of your mind and settles there, growing roots that you can never fully pull out. As for Rachel, the question of what happened to her still haunts me. The police never found any evidence of foul play, and the hospital was officially listed as nothing more than an eyesore to be avoided. But I still hear stories. The locals around the area whisper about strange happenings in the old building, lights flickering when there shouldn't be any electricity, sounds of footsteps when the place should be empty. Some even claim they've seen figures moving behind the broken windows, and not just the typical drifters or thrill seekers you'd expect in a place like that. People say they've seen her, Rachel, still there, her face twisted in a look of fear, her eyes hollow and empty. I can't decide if I want to believe those stories or if I should ignore them completely. After all, it's easy to see how rumors can take on a life of their own, how a haunted hospital can become the stuff of local legend. But something inside me tells me there's more to it than that. There's a truth buried somewhere in that darkness, one that no one, least of all me, has been brave enough to confront. Every now and then, I drive past that hospital, but I never stop. The temptation is there, to go back, to face whatever it was that we ran from, to find out if Rachel is still trapped inside. But I know better now. It's not the kind of thing you confront. Some things are better left untouched. I don't sleep the way I used to. I don't think I ever will again. The nights are restless, filled with dreams of that place, dreams that always end the same way, with me running through dark hallways, feeling the pressure of unseen eyes on my back, and the sense that something is right behind me, just out of sight. I wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in sweat, only to find that I'm still in my own bed. Safe. For now. But then there are those moments, those fleeting seconds when I feel the cold presence again, that familiar feeling of being watched. I look around, expecting to see something, but there's nothing. And in those moments, I can't help but wonder, was it ever really over? The truth is, I don't know. The answers to the questions that haunt me are still out of reach, buried in the walls of that hospital, locked behind doors that no one should ever open. And so, I move on with my life, pretending to leave it all behind. But I know deep down that I'll never be the same. That night in the hospital changed me, and the lingering fear, The unsettling sense that something is still out there, following me, will never go away. It will live on in the quiet moments, in the spaces between breaths, and in the darkness that always seems to close in, no matter where I am. It was just another typical Saturday morning when I found myself, once again, standing at the edge of an old park. This place had always intrigued me, yet it remained a mere passing thought for most of my life. I'd lived in the same town for years and often walked past this park, never truly taking the time to step in and explore it. It wasn't that it was anything particularly remarkable, it was just a neglected, slightly overgrown area of green tucked away at the end of town. Still, there was something about it that always seemed off. Maybe it was the tall, looming trees that seemed to stretch high into the sky, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. Or perhaps it was the rusted gates that seemed to groan when the winds passed through. Either way, it piqued my curiosity. I wasn't in any rush that Saturday. My usual routine had been put on hold for the weekend. No errands to run, no obligations to fulfill. Just a simple, quiet day. And so, with nothing better to do, I decided it was finally time to take a stroll into the park. I had nothing to lose and was looking for a change of pace. A moment of solitude away from the bustle of my daily life. The park had always been a mystery to the townspeople. Over the years, people came and went, but the park remained largely untouched. There were rumors, whispers, really, that the park wasn't as empty as it seemed. But that was all they were, rumors. No one could truly explain what went on in that park, but it had developed a reputation over the years. Some said it was haunted. Some claimed strange things happened to people who stayed there too long. Others simply avoided it, preferring to walk a few blocks farther down to the newer, more well-kept park. But the stories didn't bother me. I wasn't one to let old legends dictate what I did or where I went. The morning air was crisp, fresh, and calming, which made the park feel even more inviting. As I pushed the old wrought iron gates open, they creaked loudly, but not in a way that felt unsettling. It was more like the sound of something tired, something that had endured years of wear and tear. As I stepped inside, I took in the sight of the place. The grass was slightly overgrown, but it didn't look unkempt, just natural, untouched by the hands of time. The trees stretched high above me, casting long shadows on the ground as the sun filtered through their thick foliage. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic from the main road, and the chirp of birds perched high in the trees. There were no other visitors in sight, which only made the place feel even more isolated. It was quiet, too quiet for a park. I noticed a few benches scattered around, some covered with moss, others half hidden by the thick foliage. The paths were narrow, winding, and mostly covered with leaves, as if they hadn't been tended to in years. The old stone pathways led me further into the park, with each turn revealing something new, something more mysterious than the last. I began walking further down one of the narrow paths, each step crunching underfoot as the dried leaves beneath my shoes shifted. The feeling of isolation crept over me as the noise from the outside world seemed to fade, swallowed by the dense trees and underbrush. But there was something strangely calming about it all, as though this place had its own rhythm, its own pulse. I walked deeper into the park, the tall trees towering over me as if they were silently watching my every move. The further I went, the more the feeling of being observed grew stronger. I paused for a moment, letting my senses take in the surroundings. The stillness of the air, the absence of other people, the odd serenity of a park that should have felt more alive. At the far end of the park, I noticed an old stone fountain, its once ornate carvings now withered by time. The fountain stood still, silent, with only a faint trickle of water trickling down the sides, pooling at the base. It was an eerie sight, something that should have been teeming with life, but instead had been abandoned to the forces of nature. As I approached, I noticed the water wasn't clear, but murky and dark. A strange, unsettling feeling crept up my spine as I stared into the depths, feeling as though something was waiting for me beneath the surface. There was no one around. No children laughing, no dogs barking, not even a sound from the wind. The silence of this place was unnerving. I shook it off, dismissing the thought. After all, I wasn't one to let my imagination get the better of me. Yet, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, like the park was somehow alive in a way that I couldn't quite understand. The way the trees bent and swayed with the wind, the way the path twisted and turned as if leading me further into the unknown, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer as if something was watching. I continued walking, my curiosity outweighing the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't ready to leave just yet. There was more to this place, something more hidden beneath the surface, and I was determined to find it. After all, it was just a park, right? I had been walking through the park for what felt like hours. The shadows of the trees stretched longer, casting a dull, almost oppressive atmosphere over the path. Despite the park's solitude, I felt drawn deeper into its heart, where the once beautiful fountain lay hidden behind thick brush and moss-covered stones. As I passed beneath the towering trees, I noticed that the air had shifted, becoming unnervingly still. The usual sounds of nature had faded, and a strange, almost suffocating silence surrounded me. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect from a peaceful park. It was the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something that hasn't quite happened yet, but is on the verge of doing so. I shook my head, trying to clear the sudden tension that had risen in my chest. "It's just an old, quiet park," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But even as I said the words, I couldn't help but feel as though I was being pulled into something I didn't fully understand. As I continued walking down the path, I noticed something odd. A small, crumpled piece of paper was lying on the ground. It wasn't a leaf or a twig, but paper with faded ink on it. It stood out against the soft dirt and fallen leaves, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally. I bent down to pick it up, brushing the dirt off its surface. The paper was old, yellowed, with creases and smudges. The handwriting was messy and difficult to read, but the few words I could make out sent a chill down my spine. "Leave before it's too late." I froze, holding the paper in my hand. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just some random trash or forgotten note. There was a clear message on it, something that felt urgent. I scanned my surroundings, half expecting someone to jump out from behind one of the trees or bushes. But there was nothing. No one. The park remained eerily silent, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I stood there for a moment, turning the paper over in my hands. Why would someone leave this here? Was it some kind of prank? A practical joke? I didn't believe in coincidences, though, and my gut was telling me something wasn't right. Despite myself, my thoughts wandered back to the rumors I'd heard over the years, the stories about the park being haunted, or worse, something far darker. I quickly dismissed the thought. It was just a park, after all. People always found ways to create stories about places like this. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I stuffed the paper into my jacket pocket, trying to push aside the growing sense of dread that had begun to creep up on me. As I continued down the path, I heard a rustling in the bushes to my left. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. It wasn't a small animal or the wind. This was something different. Something far too deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, watching the bushes intently. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had started. My eyes scanned the area, but there was nothing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around, feeling as though I was being watched from the trees. My instincts told me to leave, but a part of me, curious, perhaps even foolish, wanted to know what was going on. I took a deep breath, forcing my feet to move again. I walked further into the park, passing by a few more benches, their surfaces worn and cracked by the passage of time. The air felt thicker now, as if the park itself was pressing in around me. The silence felt oppressive. I could no longer ignore the sense that something wasn't right. As I walked further, I came to a small clearing in the woods. The path narrowed here, and the trees closed in on both sides, creating a tunnel of sorts. In the center of the clearing stood a large, old tree, its roots sprawling out in all directions like veins in the earth. The trunk was gnarled, twisted, and dark, as if it had seen centuries pass by. And yet, there was something strangely beautiful about it, a beauty that was tinged with something darker. I approached the tree slowly, feeling drawn to it despite the unease that gnawed at me. As I reached out to touch the rough bark, something caught my eye. There, carved into the wood, was a symbol, a strange circular pattern that looked almost like a spiral. It was faint, worn down by years of weather, but it was unmistakable. It was as if the tree had been marked, branded with some sort of ritualistic symbol. My pulse quickened as I ran my fingers over the symbol. It felt cold, almost unnatural, like the tree itself was alive and reacting to my touch. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the thought that something or someone was near. I took a few steps back, my breath shallow. When I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a low groan, came from deep within the trees. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I turned sharply, scanning the trees around me, but there was no one. No movement, no sign of life. Just the empty, silent woods. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps the park's eerie stillness was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was no logical explanation for the growing sense of dread that hung in the air, or the strange events that seemed to follow me as I ventured deeper into the park. Without thinking, I turned and started walking back the way I came, my pace quickening. I had had enough of this place. As I retraced my steps, the unsettling feeling lingered, refusing to let go. The rustling in the bushes, the cryptic message on the paper, and the strange carving in the tree, all of it was starting to make my head spin. Suddenly, I heard another rustling noise, this time much closer. I froze again, heart racing. This time, the sound was more distinct. There was definitely something moving in the underbrush. I glanced around, but all I could see was the thick wall of trees. The park was becoming darker, the light filtering through the branches now casting eerie shadows all around me. Something was coming closer, something I couldn't see. I turned and sprinted down the path, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I forced myself to slow down though. I couldn't keep running forever, and if whatever was following me wasn't real, then I was only making myself look foolish. Still, every nerve in my body screamed at me to keep moving, but I resisted. I paused, trying to steady my breathing, and listened. The silence was thick, almost unnatural. The birds weren't singing anymore, and the wind had stopped rustling the leaves. It felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. I stood there in the middle of the path, trying to gather my thoughts, when I noticed something strange, a faint shadow moving between the trees to my right. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there, and my heart skipped a beat. The shadow darted in and out of view, like someone was walking just out of sight, keeping to the shadows. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I took a step forward, and then another. My feet felt heavier with each movement, as though the air around me had thickened and was trying to keep me in place. I took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and forced myself to take another step. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack. It was the sound of something breaking a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I spun around, eyes scanning the trees around me, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no indication that anything had happened at all. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I started walking briskly, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. But just as I passed a particularly dense thicket of trees, I felt something brush against my arm. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, deliberate touch, like a hand grazing my skin. I gasped, pulling my arm away and stumbling backward. My heart raced and a wave of panic flooded my chest. There was no one here. No one could have touched me. I glanced over my shoulder again, but I saw nothing. No figures, no shapes, nothing. The park was as still as ever, the only sound my erratic breathing. I forced myself to move forward again, this time not caring how fast I was walking, just needing to get out of that suffocating silence. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the path. The park had taken on a completely different feeling in the fading light. It felt alive in a way that didn't make sense. As I walked, I found myself passing the same spots over and over. The path seemed to loop back on itself, like it was winding in on me. The more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I couldn't remember how long it had been since I had passed the fountain, or where I'd last seen the carved tree. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming, as if the park was playing tricks on me, repeating the same scenes in an endless cycle. I stopped in the middle of the path, heart pounding in my chest. No, I whispered to myself, this isn't real. This is just stress. Just your mind messing with you. But even as I spoke the words, I knew something wasn't right. The air was growing colder, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest. It was as if I were being pulled, as if the park itself were coaxing me deeper into its darkened heart. I forced my legs to move again, but this time they felt heavier than ever, like they were stuck in mud, struggling to lift with each step. It was then that I saw a flash of white at the edge of my vision. It was just a glimpse, but it was enough to freeze me in my tracks. A figure, pale, almost ethereal, stood at the far end of the path, just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague silhouette, and yet I could feel its presence, as though it were staring straight at me. I took a hesitant step forward, my curiosity fighting against the fear that was gnawing at my insides. The figure didn't move, but I could feel the oppressive weight of its gaze, pressing down on me, urging me to come closer. It was like an invisible force was pulling me toward it, and no matter how hard I fought it, I couldn't stop. I walked slowly, my feet dragging along the path. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was trying to swallow me whole. As I got closer, I realized that the figure wasn't getting any clearer. It was like it was both there and not there, flickering in and out of view like a fading memory. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. My throat felt tight, and the words sounded foreign to my own ears. There was no answer, just the unsettling silence of the park. I took another step. Suddenly, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, standing in the distance, and the next it was gone, like it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to reappear. But it didn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I turned around quickly, my eyes darting to every corner of the park, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing. The path was empty, the trees still and silent. I had to get out. I turned and ran. The air felt thicker with every step, and the path seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced behind me, I expected to see something or someone just out of reach. The shadows seemed to grow longer, more distorted, as though they were reaching out to grab me. I didn't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only minutes. My chest burned with each breath, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had to get out of this place before whatever was in the park found me. But no matter how fast I ran, the park never seemed to end. The trees loomed overhead, the shadows growing darker, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, as if on cue, the rustling returned. It was louder this time, more distinct. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps. Someone was following me, and they were getting closer. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. The footsteps behind me had grown louder, closer, faster. My lungs burned with each breath I took, and the rhythm of my heart seemed to echo in my ears, drowning out everything else. But it wasn't just the sound of my own footsteps anymore. There were other steps, heavier, more deliberate, following me, closing in with each passing moment. Something, or someone, was behind me, tracking my every movement. I pushed myself harder, my feet slamming against the earth as I tried to outrun whatever was chasing me. But the park seemed endless, the path stretching on, winding and twisting like a maze that I couldn't escape. Every turn I took only brought me back to where I started. It was like the park itself had become a prison, and I was trapped inside, the walls closing in with every second. Then, without warning, the air around me grew still. The footsteps behind me stopped. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. I stumbled to a halt, my chest heaving with exhaustion, and turned around, half expecting to see something standing in the path behind me. But there was nothing, no figure, no shadow, no sign of movement. I stood frozen in place, my eyes scanning the darkness, my breath ragged in the thick air. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that something was there, just beyond my reach. My senses were on high alert, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to run, to escape. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my vision, a pale figure standing motionless at the edge of the path. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But I knew it was still there. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I took a tentative step forward, my body trembling with fear, and the figure reappeared closer now, almost within reach. I couldn't make out any details at first. It was just a shape, a faint silhouette against the dark trees, but it wasn't human. Not entirely. There was something wrong about it. The way it stood so still, its shape twisting and shifting as if it were made of shadows rather than flesh. Its face was obscured, but the longer I stared, the more I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, drilling into me. I took a step back, my mind racing, my body trembling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. The park, this cursed place, had to be playing tricks on me, twisting my perception, warping reality itself. There was no way this thing, whatever it was, could be real. But every instinct inside me told me otherwise. The fear I felt was all too real. The terror was suffocating. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, keeping me trapped in the grip of whatever force had taken hold of the park. My feet were glued to the path, my body unable to respond to my frantic mind's commands. That's when it spoke. The voice wasn't human, it couldn't have been. It was raspy, like the sound of dead leaves scraping across stone, and yet it felt like it was coming from inside my own mind, filling every corner of my consciousness. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the words slow and deliberate. "You should have stayed away." I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. I was completely at its mercy. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each beat of my heart loud enough to drown out the world. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking, barely above a breath. The figure tilted its head slightly, and for the first time I saw its face, or at least what passed for one. It was pale, impossibly so, its skin almost translucent, like a ghost or a wraith. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and hollow, empty pits that seemed to consume the very light around them. They were endless, infinite, and they stared at me with an intensity that sent a chill straight to my bones. "Because," it whispered, "this is my domain, and now you're a part of it." I stumbled back, my heart racing. I tried to run again, but it was as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand. The harder I tried to move, the more it dragged me down, deeper and deeper into the suffocating darkness of the park. The trees, once distant and silent, now loomed over me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves rustling in a way that sounded almost deliberate. I could hear the laughter again, louder this time, echoing in my ears. It wasn't just one voice now, it was a chorus of voices, low and mocking, overlapping each other, filling the air with a sense of dread. The sound was coming from all around me, from the very trees, from the shadows, from the ground beneath my feet. The figure stepped closer, its body flickering and shifting as though it were made of smoke, as though it didn't belong in this world. It was impossible to focus on it. My eyes couldn't keep up with its movement, my brain unable to process what I was seeing. "You will never leave," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other. "You'll be here, just like the others, forever." I felt my throat tighten, panic flooding my senses. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the park's malevolent presence. I could feel the darkness closing in, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket, and I knew deep down I wasn't going to make it out. And then it touched me. The cold that radiated from its fingers was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was as if it had sucked all warmth and life from my body in an instant. My skin felt like ice, my muscles stiffening with each passing second. My vision blurred, my body grew heavy, and I felt like I was sinking, falling into an abyss from which I would never return. The darkness consumed me completely, a void so deep that it felt as if I had been swallowed by the earth itself. There were no stars, no light, nothing to guide me. I didn't know if I was standing or falling, if I was alive or dead. The sensation of being pulled deeper into something unspeakable gripped me with a cold, terrifying certainty. The coldness of that touch, the suffocating dread that had overtaken my body, still lingered, paralyzing my every thought. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the weight lifted. The feeling of being trapped in a dreamless abyss vanished, and I was back in the park, but everything had changed. It was no longer the park I had known. The once familiar path had turned into something twisted, contorted, as though the ground itself had been altered by the darkness that had been so eager to claim me. I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing, but there was something else, a subtle shift in the air, a hum beneath the silence, like the very fabric of reality had been frayed and was trying to snap back into place. But there was no time to process it. The trees, those twisted, skeletal shapes, loomed overhead, but they didn't look the same. Their branches were gnarled and knotted, reaching for me with a terrifying, unnatural eagerness. The whispers, the laughter, it had all faded, leaving a dead quiet in its wake. But I wasn't alone. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and that's when I saw a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the fading light of the park. It was the same figure I had seen earlier, the one that had haunted me with its laughter, its whispers, its dark promises. But now it stood motionless, its shape indistinct, as if it were made of shadows, a ghostly silhouette against the dimming horizon. Its presence alone filled the air with an unnatural weight, like a storm on the verge of breaking. The figure remained still, but I could feel its presence pushing against me, pulling me closer, as though it were beckoning me forward. For the briefest of moments, I wondered if this was at the end. Would I disappear into the same darkness that had tried to swallow me whole? Would I become like one of the countless souls lost to the park, trapped forever in its twisted, forsaken corners? I didn't know how much time passed before I gathered enough strength to move, but when I did, it was instinct that guided me. My body acted on its own, my legs carrying me forward, away from that figure, away from the oppressive force that seemed to be suffocating me. I ran. The path seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, but I pushed myself harder, faster. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't afford to stop. I couldn't afford to look back. The fear that had taken root in my chest drove me forward, the need to escape overwhelming every other thought. The trees blurred past me, their twisted forms barely recognizable in the flickering, dim light. The laughter, the whispers, it was all gone now. replaced by a profound silence that rang in my ears. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, until the first slivers of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The sky lightened, the park's twisted form beginning to take shape again, but something was different. The air was no longer heavy with dread. The darkness that had once clung to me seemed to lift, as if the park had released its grip, allowing me to escape its suffocating embrace. When I finally reached the edge of the park, I stopped. I stood at the boundary, my feet frozen to the ground, unable to move any further. The park lay behind me, its trees now nothing more than dark shadows against the lightening sky. I felt the weight of the experience crash down on me, everything that had happened, everything that I had barely managed to survive. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. But as I stood there, looking back at the park, something stopped me cold. The figure, its dark silhouette, was standing at the very edge of the park, watching me. It hadn't followed me, but it didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to make my blood run cold. The laughter, the whispers, the terror, they had all faded, but I could still feel the echo of it in my bones. I didn't know if I had truly escaped, or if the park had simply allowed me to leave, like some cruel game where the rules were never clear. I didn't know if I would ever be free of it. And so, I left the park behind, never to return. The world seemed brighter, the air cleaner, but the questions lingered. What had I encountered? Was it a figment of my imagination, a trick played on me by the twisted remnants of the park's dark history? Or had I come too close to something I was never meant to understand? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never step foot in that park again. I could never go back. The aftermath of the experience would stay with me, a shadow that I couldn't shake. And though I tried to move on with my life, every so often, when the night was still and the world felt too quiet, I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, lurking just out of sight. But it never appeared. Still, the memory of it haunted me. I didn't speak of it to anyone. No one would have believed me. They would have thought I was mad, or worse, that I had imagined it all. But I knew the truth. I had seen it. I had felt its presence. And the fear it had planted in me would never fade. The days passed after that night, but they were never quite the same. Time didn't feel like time anymore. Every second seemed to stretch out longer than it should, weighed down by the gravity of what I had experienced. It was as if the park had left an imprint on my very soul, something that could never be erased, no matter how hard I tried to shake it off. I couldn't forget the twisted trees, the unnerving presence, the silent pull of that figure, waiting for me at the park's edge. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered with me at all times. There were moments when I would catch myself staring out of windows, scanning the horizon, expecting to see that silhouette standing in the distance. But nothing ever came. Still, the terror had planted a seed in me, one that had taken root deep within, and now I was left to live with its after effects. It wasn't just the fear that lingered. It was the questions. The unanswered questions that gnawed at me every time I tried to put the experience out of my mind. What had I witnessed that night? Was it something supernatural, something ancient that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for someone to stumble into its web? Or was it something far more personal, a manifestation of my own terror, brought to life by the fear and isolation I had felt in that park? There were no answers, only the unsettling certainty that I would never know. But life went on. I resumed my daily routine, the one I had before the park. I went to work, met with friends, and tried to live as though nothing had happened. But it was a facade. Every time I passed a certain street or took a familiar route, I would feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart would race, and for a split second, I would wonder if I was being followed. But no one ever appeared. The park was always just out of reach, a forbidden place I could never return to. I tried to speak to others about it, to find someone who would understand. But the looks I received were always the same, concern mixed with disbelief. No one understood. No one could comprehend what I had gone through, what I had seen. It wasn't something you could explain to someone who had never felt that kind of terror, that raw, unrelenting fear that gripped your body and your mind. It was a sensation that could only be understood by those who had faced it. And even then, the answers were elusive. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in my mind. What had I missed? What was I supposed to have learned from it? And why had I been the one to encounter that thing in the first place? It felt like a twisted fate, a curse that had been placed upon me without my consent. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. I wasn't afraid of the park anymore. I wasn't afraid of what had happened to me. I was afraid of the fact that I would never know the truth. The unknown, what was hidden beneath the surface of that place, was what scared me the most. And no matter how much time passed, it would always haunt me like an unanswered question that I couldn't shake. I had escaped the park that night, yes, but in a way, it had never let me go. It had followed me, leaving a scar on my memory, an imprint on my thoughts. And now, years later, I could still feel its presence in the back of my mind. It was always there, lurking, waiting for the next person to find it. I'll never know. But as I walked away from the place that haunted my every step, I could only hope that the shadows had finally receded for good. That the park, whatever it was, had moved on, leaving behind nothing but the ghosts of those who had come before me. I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago, something that still makes me feel uneasy when I think about it. At the time, it felt like just another weekend adventure, but looking back, I can tell you it was much more than that. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip into the nearby woods. I was an outdoors person, used to hiking, camping, and exploring the natural beauty of my surroundings. But on this particular day, I thought I'd take it easy. The goal was simple: a quiet drive up to the local national park, take in the scenery, and do a bit of walking. I had been planning this weekend getaway for a few weeks, and everything seemed perfect. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and I was eager to leave behind the bustle of everyday life for a few hours. I had packed my backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my camera to capture any interesting sights. I even made sure to load up my car with a full tank of gas, just to make sure I wouldn't have to stop along the way. This was supposed to be my peaceful retreat, a much-needed break from the grind. On the way, I noticed the roads were quieter than usual. It was a Saturday afternoon, so I expected a bit more traffic, but maybe people were staying in, or perhaps the weather had kept them inside. Whatever the reason, it felt almost like I had the whole world to myself. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the open road. I couldn't have asked for a better start to the day. When I got closer to the park entrance, I decided to use my GPS to ensure I didn't take a wrong turn. I'm familiar with the area, but I wanted to avoid any unnecessary detours. The GPS had worked perfectly for every trip I'd made up there before, so I figured I'd just follow its directions and let it guide me. And that's when things started to feel off. As I continued to drive, the streets gradually became narrower, the houses fewer and farther apart. The surroundings turned from suburban streets to thick forest, with towering trees on either side of the road. It was beautiful in a raw, unrefined way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced at my phone, no service. That's not unusual for that area, I thought. Cell reception was spotty once you got out of town, and I was already used to the occasional lack of signal. But then the GPS seemed to glitch. It wasn't a dramatic failure, more like a stutter. I checked it again. It was as though it was recalculating, trying to find its bearings, but the map seemed to spin for a few seconds before snapping back into place. At first, I dismissed it, a little hiccup in technology. It happens. But after a few more minutes, the same thing happened. It wasn't a big deal, but it was the kind of thing that started to scratch at the back of my mind. I wasn't exactly lost, but the path ahead was less familiar than I'd anticipated. I assumed it was just the GPS being finicky, a byproduct of being in an area that wasn't exactly well charted. I passed a few empty houses and a couple of abandoned barns. The deeper I drove into the woods, the more it felt like I was leaving civilization behind. I thought about turning back, but I shrugged off the uneasy feeling. After all, I had driven this far. I was just a few miles away from the park entrance. I had to keep going. I wasn't a stranger to the feeling of isolation, but this was different. As I passed an old, weathered sign that indicated the park was just ahead, I noticed something strange. The GPS now read, "No signal," and the map was gone, replaced by a blank white screen. It wasn't a huge surprise given the lack of service, but something about that blank map left me feeling oddly unsettled. Maybe it was just the isolation, but the longer I drove, the more I felt like I was being led somewhere. It was like the GPS wasn't just taking me on a route, it was guiding me towards something. I couldn't explain it, but the thought lingered. I kept my eyes on the road as the dense trees lined either side of me. The branches almost seemed to reach out, like they were trying to pull me deeper into the woods. It wasn't a threatening presence, more like a quiet, watchful force, just there, as though nature itself was quietly observing my every move. And then, out of nowhere, the road began to twist. One sharp curve followed by another. The GPS remained frozen. I slowed down instinctively, unsure of what lay ahead. The air grew colder, even though it was still mid-afternoon, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn farther and farther from the world I knew. As I continued driving deeper into the woods, the feeling of unease only grew. The trees were so thick now, their branches so heavy, that the sunlight barely reached the road. It felt almost like I was entering a tunnel, a natural passage where the outside world had faded away. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Everything was quiet, eerily quiet. I checked the GPS once more, hoping it would show me the familiar route to the park entrance, but the screen remained frozen. I tapped the screen, but nothing happened. I was starting to feel a bit of frustration. I relied on my GPS for trips like this, especially when I wasn't entirely familiar with the back roads. Without it, I was left to rely on my memory, and even though I had been here before, it wasn't enough to reassure me. A couple more miles passed, and I noticed something strange, a vehicle ahead. At first, I thought it was just another car, maybe a fellow adventurer heading into the park. But as I got closer, the situation felt off. The vehicle was parked on the side of the road, right under the shadow of the trees. No one was in it. I slowed down as I approached, my eyes scanning the vehicle. It was an older model, some sort of rusty pickup truck. There were no signs of life, no movement inside or around it. I pulled up alongside it, glancing into the interior. It was empty, save for a few scattered belongings, a jacket, a bag, and a couple of empty water bottles on the seat. The truck seemed out of place here, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't explain why, but something about it struck me as strange. Maybe it was the fact that there was no sign of the driver, or the unsettling silence of the scene. Or maybe it was the way the truck sat there, almost as if it had been waiting for someone. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it for a few moments. Then, without thinking too much about it, I drove past. I tried to shake off the discomfort, telling myself it was just some random vehicle left behind, but I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The truck was still there, parked just as it had been. But something had changed. For the briefest moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing by the truck, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and glanced again. There was no one there. It must have been my imagination, I thought. But that wasn't the only odd thing that happened. As I continued on the road, I started to notice something else, strange markings on the trees. At first, they were subtle. A slash here, a scratch there. Nothing that screamed danger, but enough to catch my attention. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming they were just marks from wildlife, or perhaps other hikers who had come this way before. But as the marks became more frequent, the unease started to build. Some of the trees had deep gashes in them, almost like they had been carved into. Others had strange symbols scratched into the bark, simple lines and curves, but they didn't resemble any markings I'd seen before. The feeling of being watched intensified. I reached for my phone, hoping to get some signal, but it was still dead. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. I let out a frustrated sigh and shoved the phone back into my pocket. I was getting annoyed now. This was supposed to be a relaxing trip. All I wanted was a peaceful day in the woods, and here I was, dealing with a malfunctioning GPS and strange symbols on the trees. The road ahead twisted again, and I slowed down, instinctively gripping the steering wheel tighter. The trees seemed to close in on me even more, their branches stretching across the road like skeletal fingers, casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. The world around me felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I rounded the next bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, it looked like just another stretch of road, but then I realized it wasn't. It was a clearing, and in the center of the clearing was a large stone, half covered in moss. It looked like something ancient, out of place in the middle of the woods. I slowed to a stop, staring at the stone. It was large, at least 6 feet tall, and had strange, weathered markings carved into its surface. They were unlike anything I had ever seen. Some of the lines looked like symbols, but others were more abstract curved shapes, spirals, and what looked like a series of numbers. I stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting me immediately. My breath came out in visible puffs as I took a few cautious steps toward the stone. There was something undeniably wrong about it. It didn't belong here. The forest was full of life, but the stone felt dead, like it had been standing there for centuries, untouched by time or nature. The wind had stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. I walked around the stone, examining it closely. As I touched the surface, a strange chill ran through my fingertips. It wasn't cold, not in the way you'd expect from stone. It was something deeper, like a coldness that seeped into your bones. I quickly withdrew my hand and took a step back. That's when I heard it, a soft crackling sound coming from the trees. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, like the sound of dry leaves crunching beneath footsteps. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the trees, standing tall and silent, their shadows stretching across the ground. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of it all. The chill in the air was growing more intense, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. This wasn't just some quirky part of the woods. There was something wrong here. I quickly turned around and made my way back to the car, not daring to look behind me. I slammed the door shut and started the engine. The GPS was still frozen and my phone was still dead. But something else had changed. There was a weight in the air now, like I was no longer alone in the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't waste any more time. I pressed the accelerator and sped down the road, my eyes darting between the path ahead and the trees surrounding me. The further I drove, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, until I could hardly see the road in front of me. I didn't know it then, but the worst was yet to come. The further I drove, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart beat faster, and I couldn't bring myself to relax, no matter how many deep breaths I took. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes made me jump, my eyes flicking nervously between the road and the forest surrounding me. It felt like the trees were closing in even more with every mile I drove. They were so thick now, their trunks impossibly wide, their roots curling out like ancient fingers reaching into the earth. The entire forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. I glanced at the GPS again. It had gone completely blank. I swore under my breath and swiped at the screen, but it remained stubbornly unresponsive. I needed to find my way back. This wasn't just a wrong turn anymore. The road felt endless, the twists and turns too sharp, too unpredictable. I was in unfamiliar territory now. I slowed the car, wondering if I should stop and take a moment to think. The trees parted for a brief moment, offering a glimpse of the sky above. For just a split second, I felt some semblance of normalcy, like the outside world was still out there somewhere, just beyond the horizon. But as quickly as it appeared, the trees swallowed the view again, and the weight of the forest settled in, suffocating. I was beginning to feel lightheaded, as if the air itself was thick with something oppressive, something that made every breath feel more difficult. And then I saw a flash of movement on the side of the road. I slammed my foot on the brake, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I couldn't make it out clearly, just a blur of motion darting behind the trees. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal too big. It wasn't another person either, not unless they were moving with inhuman speed. I blinked hard and leaned forward, trying to see through the trees, but there was nothing. Only shadows and the quiet murmur of the wind moving through the leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But the feeling that something or someone was out there never left me. It was there, pressing against my thoughts, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. And then I saw another thing, another oddity that I couldn't explain. The road began to widen as I drove deeper, and there, just off the shoulder, was another stone. It wasn't like the first one. This one was smaller, but it had strange carvings on it. Symbols, letters, numbers, I couldn't tell. And it was placed in the middle of a small clearing, almost as though it had been deliberately placed there. I slowed down and pulled the car to a stop, hesitant to get out, but something compelled me to. I had to know what was going on. I stepped out of the car, the cool air hitting me immediately. My breath came out in visible puffs. I had to admit I was feeling a little more than unnerved now. The stone stood taller than I'd expected. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, despite the fact that it seemed to have been there for a long time. The carvings were worn, but they were unmistakable, a series of intricate lines, spirals, and what seemed like animal tracks. The wind picked up again, rustling through the leaves, and I swore I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but the sound kept growing, closer now, right behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Nothing. The wind was the only thing moving. It was too quiet, too still. I took a step back, instinctively moving toward the car. That's when I saw it, the same strange symbol carved into the trees, now more distinct, as if someone had added to it since I last noticed. The marks were too deliberate, too uniform to be natural, and they led off into the woods. At first, I thought it might be some sort of trail, but the more I looked at it, the more it felt like an invitation, something that wasn't meant to be ignored. I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. The chill in the air grew sharper, biting at my skin, urging me to leave. But I couldn't. There was something here, something I had to understand. With my hand on the car door for reassurance, I stepped away from the stone and followed the markings, moving deeper into the woods. The more I walked, the denser the forest became. The trees grew taller and twisted, their trunks gnarled and ancient, as though they had been here for centuries. Every step I took was met with the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The markings on the trees were more frequent now, more pronounced. They weren't random, they were organized, almost like a trail. I followed it without thinking, my mind on edge, adrenaline coursing through my veins. It wasn't just the markings that unsettled me, it was the feeling that something was watching, something just out of sight. Every so often, I would glance behind me, but the forest remained still, unchanging. I didn't know how far I'd gone when the forest finally opened up to reveal another clearing, one far larger than the first. At the center stood a structure, a stone circle, ancient and weathered, its edges worn down by time. It was as if I had stumbled into a forgotten part of the world, a place untouched by modern hands. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and the silence felt even more oppressive here, as though the very ground beneath me was holding its breath. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. There were more markings on the ground lines carved into the stone, as if someone had drawn them with care. The design was intricate, a perfect blend of circles and spirals. In the center, there was a stone slab, covered in moss and what looked like remnants of old ritual sticks, feathers, and strange symbols. I froze. It was too much. I had to leave. But as I turned to head back, a sound stopped me cold. It was a low hum, deep and resonant, coming from behind me. My body froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The hum grew louder, closer, vibrating the very air around me. I turned slowly, my eyes wide, my breath caught in my throat. The stone circle seemed to shimmer, as though the very air within it was alive, rippling with some unseen force. I had to go. Now. I turned and sprinted back to the car, my heart pounding so loudly that I couldn't hear anything else. The trees blurred around me, their branches stretching out like hands trying to catch me. I didn't dare look back. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the forest itself was pulling me back, trying to drag me into its depths. I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't waste a second. I started the engine and sped off, the trees blurring past me as I raced down the road. But even as I drove, the hum lingered in my ears, echoing in the silence of my mind. The woods were far behind me now, but I knew that something had followed me. Something that hadn't wanted me to leave. I thought I had escaped. The car sped down the winding road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, the trees now nothing more than a blur of shadows and moonlight. Every second felt like an eternity, each moment filled with the relentless pulse of adrenaline. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, I didn't need to. I could still feel it, the presence, the pull of the woods, as if the forest itself was reaching out to drag me back. The hum that had echoed in my ears was gone, but the dread remained, sinking deep into my bones. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stop thinking about the stone circle, the strange markings, and that feeling, the undeniable sensation that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just being paranoid. Something had been there. Something, not human. My thoughts raced faster than the car, but there was no escaping the truth. I had been drawn in, led there by something I couldn't explain. The forest, those symbols, that structure, everything had been orchestrated. But by whom? And why? The road ahead was clear, but my mind was clouded with questions, fear, and a rising sense of urgency. And then it happened. I glanced at the GPS, which had mysteriously come back online after having been blank for so long. The screen flickered as the map loaded, showing my location. But something wasn't right. My heart skipped a beat as I looked closer. The route had changed. It was no longer the path I had just taken, the one that led me away from the woods, but a different route altogether, one that seemed to curve right back into the forest. I quickly checked the road signs, but they made no sense. I had passed them minutes ago, and now I was on a road I didn't recognize. The woods were close again, too close. And the trees? They were different now, darker. I wasn't driving toward the exit, but deeper into the heart of it. My hands trembled, the steering wheel slipping in my grip. I slammed the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road with a screech of tires. The engine hummed quietly, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I turned the car off and sat there for a long moment, trying to steady myself. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to face it. My mind fought the reality of what was happening, but the truth was undeniable. Something was controlling the roads, the very path I was on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't in control anymore. The woods had swallowed me whole. I leaned forward in my seat and looked out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The trees stood just outside the reach of the car's headlights, their gnarled trunks twisting in odd, unnatural directions. It was as though the forest was alive, breathing, waiting. And then, as if on cue, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. A low rumble vibrated through the car, shaking the metal frame. I glanced out again, my eyes wide in disbelief. There, at the edge of the forest, something moved. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, stepped out from the shadows between the trees. Its shape was distorted, like it didn't belong, flickering between reality and something darker. My pulse raced, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was then that I understood. The symbols, the stone circle, the hum in the air, it had all been leading me here. To this moment. To this thing. The figure took another step, its form growing clearer. It had no face, only smooth, gray skin that seemed to absorb the light. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs were too long, too thin. It was more shadow than substance, and yet there was a presence to it that made the air feel thick with malevolence. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the figure, and it felt like it was drawing me in. It was like a deep, magnetic pull, an unseen force that reached into my chest and yanked on my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't make my body obey. The figure didn't move any closer, it didn't need to. It stood there, just at the edge of the forest, staring at me, or at least I thought it was. Its empty face bore no expression, but somehow I knew it was aware of me. The longer I looked, the more its presence filled every corner of the world, until it seemed like there was nothing else. The trees, the car, the road, all of it faded, and there was just this thing, staring at me from the darkness. And then, out of nowhere, the hum returned. This time, it wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, a pulse in the air that rattled my bones. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, vibrating through my teeth, my spine. It was too much. The fear that had been building up inside me now exploded, pushing my body into action. I slammed my foot on the gas, throwing the car into reverse, my heart slamming against my ribcage. I needed to get away. I had to get away. But as I threw the car into drive and sped forward, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The trees on the side of the road weren't just trees anymore. They were twisted figures, humanoid shapes, crouched in the shadows. They were watching me. No more than that, they were following me. Panic surged in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but I knew I wasn't alone. The hum grew louder, now joined by something else, a low, scraping sound, like nails dragging against metal. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, its long limbs stretching impossibly high as it watched me approach. The air seemed to warp around it, distorting reality itself. And behind it, in the forest, I saw countless others. Figures, eyes, faces. I slammed my foot on the brake, but it was too late. The car jerked forward, and in the blink of an eye, I was surrounded. The figures were everywhere now, standing in the trees, in the clearing ahead, in the car's headlights. They were closing in, moving faster than should have been possible. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the headlights as though they were no longer even human. I screamed, my throat raw, but the sound didn't seem to matter. It felt like the world had stopped, time itself was frozen. The figures began to move toward me, their movements jerky, unnatural, as though they were controlled by something beyond my understanding. And then, in the midst of the chaos, one of them stepped forward. It was taller than the rest, its thin gray form towering above me. It reached out with one impossibly long arm, its fingers curling like claws. It was too much. The world blurred into a chaotic mess of motion and fear. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The last thing I saw was the shadow of its hand, reaching for me. And then, nothing. I looked around the interior of the car. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, the air inside stale and cold. The outside world had turned pitch black, no moonlight filtering through the trees, no stars in sight. It was as if I had driven into a pocket of darkness, a place where time had stopped altogether. I glanced at the rearview mirror, nothing. No figures, no movement. The road behind me was clear, and the trees stood motionless, their branches swaying gently in the wind, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I had seen them. The figures, the thing in the woods. I had felt their presence, the malevolent force that seemed to pull me in, and yet, now, everything felt strangely calm. Was I still in the same place? Was this real? Or was I somehow trapped in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from? I tried to move, but my body felt stiff, like it had been locked in place for far too long. My muscles ached from tension, and I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the lingering dizziness. I was disoriented, but something told me I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get out. I shifted the car into drive and slowly eased forward, my hands still trembling. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but there was no sign of the figures. No sign of the strange, otherworldly presence that had stalked me moments ago. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and quiet, as if I were driving through an ordinary forest on an ordinary night. But I wasn't fooled. I knew something had happened. Something I couldn't explain. As I continued driving, the sense of unease only grew. The silence was suffocating. It was as if the entire world had been muted, the air thick with a weight I couldn't escape. I thought about turning around, going back to the point where I had seen the figures, where I had first felt the overwhelming pull of the woods. But something deep within me screamed not to. I couldn't go back. I didn't want to know what awaited me there. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding its way through the dense trees, but still there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The figures were gone. The strange hum had faded into nothing. The darkness around me felt almost normal. It was unsettling, to say the least. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. What had happened to me? Was it all a hallucination? Had I imagined the figures, the whispers, the overwhelming fear that had nearly driven me mad? But no, I knew better. I knew what I had seen. I glanced at the GPS. The screen flickered for a moment before it went blank again. The route displayed there no longer matching any of the roads I had driven on. It was as if I had never left, as if I was still trapped in some loop. The cold air hit my face as I opened the door and stepped out of the car. The forest stretched out around me, silent and still, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the surroundings, trying to make sense of it all. I took a few shaky steps forward, my feet crunching against the gravel. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt compelled to find something, anything that could explain what had happened. Then, Just as I was beginning to wonder if it had all been a figment of my imagination, I spotted something in the distance. A faint glow flickering through the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out, but the light was dim and uncertain, almost like a shadow. Without thinking, I began to walk toward it. My body moved on its own, drawn toward the strange light like a moth to a flame. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew I had to get closer. The closer I got, the more the light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. It was a lantern, swinging in the breeze, but where was it coming from? I stepped into a clearing, the light growing brighter. And there, standing in the middle of the clearing, was something I hadn't noticed before. A stone structure, round and ancient-looking, covered in moss and vines. The stones were dark, almost black, and arranged in a perfect circle. The air around the structure seemed to vibrate, just like it had before, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was the same stone circle, the one I had seen earlier in the night. But this time, there was no one here. No figures, no otherworldly presence. Just the stones, standing like sentinels in the middle of the clearing. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. What was this place? Why had I been drawn here? And why had it all stopped? Why had the forest those figures vanished? I didn't have the answers. Not yet. I turned away from the stone circle and looked back toward the road, my mind still reeling. It was as if I had stumbled into something ancient, something far beyond my understanding. I wasn't sure if I was safe yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get back to the world I knew. I walked back to the car, my steps unsteady but determined. My hands still shook as I got back behind the wheel, and I didn't hesitate to put the car in gear. I drove away as quickly as I could, the forest fading into the distance behind me. The GPS was still malfunctioning, the screen blank once more, but I didn't care. I just needed to leave, to escape the grip of the woods that had held me captive. As I drove further and further away, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all over? Had I truly escaped? Or was I still a part of whatever dark force had drawn me in? There were no answers, only the road ahead and the silent, lingering fear that I wasn't done with that place. That the forest, the figures, the stone circle, they were still out there, waiting for the next person to lose their way. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The road ahead stretched out, endless in its own quiet way, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a small but defiant beacon. The wind still carried a chill, but it was now a distant memory in the warmth of the car, a place where I could at least feel safe for the moment. Safe, but not free. The events from the night played in my mind, still vivid and raw. No matter how far I drove, no matter how quickly I tried to outrun the fear that had gripped me, it lingered like a shadow, always present, always there. I had escaped, or so I thought. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I had really left the woods at all. The forest had done something to me, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the figures or the unsettling hum that had surrounded me. It was the way it felt. The oppressive weight of it all, the way the trees had closed in around me, trapping me, suffocating me. It had a presence, a life of its own, and for the briefest moment, I felt like I wasn't just an observer in that place, but a part of it, drawn into its depths, its mysteries, its dark corners. I tried to shake the thought from my mind, to focus on the road, but it was no use. I knew the truth. The forest had marked me. As I approached the last stretch of road leading into town, I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. The small lights of civilization were ahead: streetlights, houses, signs of life. A world that felt so distant from the nightmare I had just left behind. The sharp contrast between the comfort of the town and the nightmare I had just endured felt almost surreal, like stepping out of one world and into another. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. The house loomed ahead, dark and still, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I'd ever feel truly safe again. I had barely gotten out of the car when I noticed something odd. My phone, which had been acting strangely throughout the night, buzzed. It was a message, a single notification from an unknown number. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to open it. Something inside me screamed not to, but my fingers moved on their own, tapping the screen, unlocking it. The message read, "You can never truly leave. You are always ours." I stood there for a long time, staring at the screen, the message burning in my mind. It was as though the forest had followed me, had reached out from wherever it existed, just beyond the veil of reality. The sensation of the figures, the whispers, the pull of the woods, they had been real. They had been a warning. I slammed the phone face down on the hood of the car, breathing heavily. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. This was not some game. This was real. The terror I had felt that night was something I would never be able to forget. But it wasn't over. The world around me seemed to close in once again. The town, the safety I had once known, seemed distant, as if it were only an illusion. I went inside my house, locking the door behind me. I sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the walls. My mind spun, unable to settle, unable to escape the haunting thought that I wasn't free. I wasn't even sure what freedom meant anymore. Was it truly the end of the road? Or had I only just begun to uncover the terrible truth? I could feel the weight of the night pressing on me, the tension in my bones, the fear lingering beneath my skin. And as I stared at the familiar surroundings of my home, I couldn't shake the thought that I might never be able to truly escape. No matter how far I ran, no matter how far I drove, the woods, the figures, the haunting message, it was as though they had marked me. They had claimed me in some way, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to get away from it. The night felt endless. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder of the reality I couldn't escape. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see something in the shadows. But there was nothing. The streetlights outside flickered briefly, casting an eerie glow on the darkened street, but everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. I closed my eyes, trying to fight the sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I thought of the figures, of the way the woods had seemed to bend and twist around me. It felt as if they had been playing with me, pulling me deeper and deeper into their grasp, only to let me go when they were done with me. Or maybe they hadn't let me go. Maybe they had only released me because they had more plans for me. The thought made me shudder. The message, the way it seemed to linger in the air like a curse, wouldn't leave my mind. I thought I had escaped. But the reality was, I would never truly be free. And no matter how far I ran, the woods would always be there, waiting. Just out of reach, but never far enough away. In the stillness of my house, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I had faced the terror and had walked away unscathed. But deep down, I knew better. It all started back in the early fall of 2015. I had just moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, a place with winding streets and old houses that looked like they had been here forever. Most people who lived here had been born and raised in the area, a quiet town where nothing much ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of place where you'd wave to the neighbor as you drove by, and the local diners served the same meals every day. I had just turned 24, fresh out of college, and searching for something new. I didn't have much to tie me down, no job yet, no real connections, just a desire for change. When I saw an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, something about it caught my attention. The place had been closed for as long as anyone could remember. Local legends and rumors whispered about strange happenings that no one could ever prove, but that didn't stop people from telling the stories. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that it was haunted by the workers who had once toiled there. Now, I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses, but there was something undeniable about the place. The tall, rusted iron gates and the windows that were boarded up tightly made it seem like the kind of place you'd find in one of those old, dusty horror movies. The fact that it had been standing there, abandoned for so long, piqued my curiosity. It wasn't long before I found myself driving past that factory every day, wondering what was inside, wondering what had happened to it, and wondering why it was left there, forgotten. It was just a factory, right? A few warehouses and machines. But something in my gut told me there was more to it. I wasn't the only one who found it intriguing, though. As I started making more friends in the town, the topic came up more often than I expected. People would talk about the factory in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid to say too much. I heard whispers about strange noise coming from it at night, people claiming to have seen shadows moving in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But one evening, I decided to see for myself. I wasn't afraid of some old building. I had been around creepy places before: ghost tours, haunted houses, and even old graveyards. I had no fear. I convinced a few new friends from town to come along with me. There were 3 of us: myself, David, and Ben. David was a local guy, about the same age as me, always joking around, and a bit of a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. Ben, on the other hand, was more reserved, and though he didn't outright believe in ghosts, he had an uneasy feeling about the factory that he could never shake. We gathered up our courage and drove to the factory on that chilly autumn evening, the kind where the air felt thick and the wind whispered through the trees. The moon was barely visible, hidden behind clouds, and there was an eerie quiet about the place as we arrived. The road leading to the factory was overgrown with weeds, and the entrance was marked by a massive, rusted gate that creaked in the wind. It was like the gate was warning us to turn around, but none of us did. We parked just outside and walked toward the entrance, the air growing colder with every step. None of us knew what to expect. The factory loomed above us, its shadow stretching across the ground like a monster. As we got closer, we noticed the boarded-up windows and the crumbling walls, the remnants of a once bustling industrial center now left to decay. The place was unsettling, but I didn't feel scared, just curious. What could possibly be so terrifying about an old factory? We hesitated for a moment, looking around, but then, as if on cue, David grabbed a large rock and threw it at one of the windows. The sound of the glass shattering echoed through the night, and for a moment, everything fell silent. My heart raced, and I swear I felt something in the air shift. But then, David let out a laugh, and we all started moving toward the entrance. The door to the factory was locked, but we easily found a loose panel that had been pried open. It wasn't much of a challenge to squeeze through. The inside smelled old musty, like mildew and rust, with the faintest hint of oil and chemicals. We were in. The factory floor was enormous, with rows of rusted machines, broken pieces of equipment scattered around, and the remnants of a bygone era. It was hard to imagine this place once being a thriving hub of activity. I took in everything around me, fascinated by the strange silence that seemed to hang in the air. Ben, though, looked uneasy, glancing over his shoulder every few moments as if something was following him. David was taking it all in stride, cracking jokes and poking fun at Ben's nervousness. But as we ventured deeper into the building, I started to feel something shift. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, a strange feeling that crept up my spine. I shrugged it off. It was just the cold, right? But then I heard it. A faint noise in the distance. It sounded like a soft, dragging sound, almost like someone was walking through the factory. I froze, motioning for the others to stop. I felt my heart skip a beat, but David, ever the skeptic, waved it off. "There's no one here," he said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "It's just the wind or the old pipes. Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence that followed felt unnatural. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. Ben, who had been walking ahead, suddenly stopped and pointed toward the far end of the factory floor. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice tense. We all turned to look in the direction he was pointing, but there was nothing, just more shadows and the eerie stillness. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to sound calm, but even I wasn't sure. Something was in that place, something that didn't belong. And that's when the first strange thing happened. The air around us seemed to grow colder as we stood in the dim light of the factory's interior. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, a sensation I couldn't quite explain. As we stood there, frozen for a moment, I glanced around, trying to dismiss the creeping unease settling in my chest. The factory had been abandoned for so long, it had to be just the wind playing tricks on us, right? But somehow, I wasn't convinced. We hadn't taken more than a few steps when I noticed it, something I couldn't explain, but something that made my stomach tighten in an instant. One of the large, rusted metal doors, located at the far end of the room, was slowly creaking open, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. There was no wind in here. The place had been sealed up for decades. Yet there it was, moving. At first, I thought maybe it was just the building settling, but no. The door was opening, and I could see it clearly in the dim light, a slow, deliberate movement. "Guys," I said, my voice lower than usual, and a slight tremor creeping in. "Did you see that?" David, who had been walking ahead, looked back at me and then toward the door. He raised an eyebrow, probably ready to crack a joke, but when his eyes met mine, the humor drained from his face. I could tell he wasn't expecting this. "What the hell?" David muttered, taking a few steps forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Ben, who had been lingering close behind, was now beside me. His face was pale, his eyes wide, scanning the dark corners of the factory. "No way. This place is messed up." His voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb whatever had just happened. The door continued to creak open, inch by inch. A shiver ran down my spine. I was no longer convinced this was just some natural occurrence. Something was happening, and we had no idea what it was. David, always the brave one, stepped forward, moving toward the door. "I'll check it out," he said, more to himself than to us. His tone was defensive, as if he needed to prove something to himself or us. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go, but something held me back. Maybe it was my own curiosity, or maybe it was the strange sense of fate that was already tying us to this place. "I'll go with you," Ben offered, his voice shaking just a little, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He seemed to be trying to hide his fear, but it wasn't working. It was evident in his posture. His shoulders were tense, his eyes darting nervously around the dark factory. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we watched David reach the door. David gripped the cold, rusted handle, testing it. It didn't budge at first, but with a grunt of effort, he managed to pull it open the rest of the way. The air around the door seemed to ripple as if something was waiting just beyond the threshold. He pushed forward into the darkness, disappearing from view. I stood still, unsure of what to do, my mind racing with a million thoughts, none of which made sense. Ben and I exchanged uneasy glances. The noise had stopped. The door was now wide open, but there was no sound of David, no sign of him at all. After a few seconds, Ben spoke, his voice cracking. "Should we go after him?" Before I could answer, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. The loud bang echoed through the factory, followed by a strange silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I jumped at the sound, my heart racing, and I took a step back. Ben's face was pale, his breathing shallow, and I could tell he was struggling to remain calm. "Let's get out of here," Ben said suddenly, grabbing my arm, his grip tight. He pulled me toward the entrance, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Something wasn't right. I felt this strange pull, a deep sense of dread that seemed to stop me in my tracks. "I'm not leaving until I know what's going on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know why I said it. It wasn't like me to be reckless, but the factory had me in its grip, its eerie presence weighing down on me. I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I shook Ben's hand off my arm and moved cautiously toward the door where David had gone. The silence around me was almost deafening. Even Ben, though clearly terrified, followed me reluctantly. We couldn't just abandon him. Not like this. We reached the door, and I felt an icy gust of air hit my face as I peered into the blackness of the hallway beyond. "David," I called out softly, my voice wavering as it echoed in the emptiness. No response. "David," I said again, a little louder this time, but still nothing. My voice seemed to disappear into the void, swallowed up by the walls around us. A chill ran down my spine as I reached out to push open the door farther. As I did, the strange air pressure seemed to shift again, and the door slammed behind us with a terrifying thud. Ben jumped back, his face etched with fear, and grabbed my arm once again. "Let's go now," he insisted, panic in his voice. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. I stepped further into the room, straining my eyes in the dark. The factory was so vast, so empty. It felt like something was waiting for us, something lurking in the shadows. And then I heard it again, the dragging noise. Only this time it was closer, far too close. It sounded like footsteps shuffling across the ground, slow and heavy, as if something was moving toward us. I spun around, heart pounding, only to see nothing. The shadows in the corners seemed to be stretching longer, twisting as if alive. The temperature seemed to drop further, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. Ben gripped my arm harder, his face a mask of pure terror. "We need to go now," he pleaded. But it was too late. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something or someone was standing at the end of the hallway, hidden just out of sight. It wasn't David. This was different. "David?" I called one last time, my voice shaking as I tried to peer through the darkness. And then the figure moved, slowly, unnaturally. I froze, rooted to the spot, watching as the silhouette in the distance took a step forward, its shape gradually becoming clearer. It was tall, too tall, and its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if it didn't belong in this world. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, more to myself than to Ben. But the words barely left my mouth before the figure took another step, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Its eyes. Glowing. Bright pale blue eyes staring directly at me from the shadows, locking onto mine with an intensity I couldn't describe. I felt like I was being pulled toward it, a strange force drawing me in, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped my heart. Without thinking, I turned and ran. Ben was already behind me, his breath heavy and frantic as he kept pace. We didn't look back. I didn't dare to. We sprinted through the factory, not caring about the noise we were making anymore, not caring if the place was alive with whatever had been hiding in the shadows. All I knew was that I needed to get out. I don't remember how long we ran, but when we finally reached the exit, I nearly collapsed in relief. We threw ourselves out of the factory's open doorway, our bodies trembling with fear and adrenaline. I slammed the door shut behind us, the sound of it echoing in my ears as the cool night air hit my face. We didn't speak for a long time. Neither of us knew what to say. Neither of us could explain what had happened. But that's when I knew. The factory wasn't just abandoned, it was something else entirely. and we had just disturbed it. The figure in the shadows, the glowing eyes, the strange force that had drawn me toward it. I tried to go back to my routine, tried to put it out of my mind, but it followed me. Everywhere I went, there was this nagging feeling, an itch at the back of my mind, urging me to go back and find out what really happened that night. I couldn't shake the thought that we had only seen a fraction of what the factory held. There was something there, something far worse than just an abandoned building, and I couldn't rest until I understood what it was. David hadn't come by the next day. Ben and I talked briefly about the events, but we hadn't made any decisions. I wanted to go back. I had to. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it felt like a need, a compulsion. Ben, on the other hand, wasn't sure. He didn't want to go back. Not after what we had experienced. But when I called David, he was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. I don't know, man. I can't get it out of my head either. The eyes. I keep seeing them in my dreams. It's like something's calling me back there. I'm not the only one feeling it, right? His words sent a chill through me. He was feeling the same pull, the same urgency to return. It wasn't just me, and that made it all the more terrifying. By the time we finally decided to return, the factory had been quiet in our minds for a few days. But the moment we arrived, the air shifted. It was as though the building itself was waiting for us. As we approached the factory's entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The place was still as silent as before, but it felt different now, alive, even. The trees surrounding it swayed in the wind, their branches scratching against the walls like fingers trying to get in. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, like everything was holding its breath, waiting. We stood there for a moment, the factory looming before us. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ben shifted from foot to foot, his unease palpable. We were both silent for a long moment, just standing there. I could feel the weight of the building pressing in on me, as though it were trying to push us away. But I wasn't about to back down now. Not when we were so close to the answers we sought. We stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the factory. As soon as we entered, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath fogging in the air. It was freezing inside, far colder than it should have been for an early evening. The factory's silence enveloped us, swallowing up every sound we made. Ben was on edge, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't like this," he muttered. "It feels wrong, like it's different now." I nodded, my throat tight. "It does feel different, like it's waiting for us." We moved further into the factory, our footsteps echoing off the cold, concrete floor. The place had a new heaviness to it, a presence. The familiar rusted machinery sat in the corners like forgotten giants, their forms looming in the shadows. We passed the old workstations, some of them still littered with tools and broken equipment, reminders of the lives that had once been here. And then I saw it again. A door. The same one. The one that had opened by itself the night we first came. It was standing ajar, just slightly, as if inviting us in. I felt that pull again, that strange force drawing me toward it. "Do you see that?" I asked Ben, my voice barely above a whisper. He followed my gaze, and I saw his eyes widen. "I see it, but I don't want to go near it. There's something wrong with that door, man. I don't think we have a choice," I said, already walking toward it. The pull was too strong. It was like the factory was calling us, telling us we needed to go through that door. As we approached, I noticed something else. The sound. It wasn't just silence anymore. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like machinery in the distance, vibrating through the walls. It was like the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something to happen. The sound grew louder as we neared the door, a low, mechanical drone that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached for the handle, and before I could touch it, I heard Ben's voice. "Wait, don't. We don't know what's on the other side." But it was too late. The door swung open on its own, the cold metal groaning in protest, as if reluctant to give way. A gust of cold air rushed out, chilling me to the bone. The smell hit me next to a strange metallic scent, like old rust mixed with something else, something rotten. I stepped through the threshold, and Ben followed reluctantly. We found ourselves in a long hallway, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in grime, the paint peeling in places. It looked like no one had been here in years, yet the air felt fresh, too fresh for a place so long abandoned. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the walls, amplifying the eerie silence. But as we walked further, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again. The hum was growing louder. It was almost vibrating the air, and I could feel it in my chest, like something was just beyond our reach, waiting. We rounded a corner, and then we saw it, a machine. A large, industrial contraption, standing alone in the center of the room. It was a huge, hulking thing, covered in rust and wires, but it was still operating. At least, that's what it looked like. The gears were turning, the hum came from inside it, and the lights flickered in its metal framework. "Why is it still running?" Ben whispered, his voice full of awe and fear. "This place has been abandoned for years." I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something wrong with it. It looked old, but at the same time, it felt as if it had been activated recently, as if it had been waiting for us. I could feel its presence, as though the machine itself was watching us. I reached out to touch it, but Ben grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "What the hell are you doing? Don't touch it." But it was too late. As soon as my fingers brushed against the machine, the humming stopped. And then, silence. Complete silence. The machine's lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought we were safe. But then, the lights dimmed entirely, and the room was plunged into darkness. And that's when I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, and inhuman. It wasn't coming from the machine. It wasn't coming from anywhere we could see. It was coming from inside my head. "Get out." The words were clear, commanding, but they weren't mine. I turned to Ben, my face pale. "Did you hear that?" Ben's eyes were wide with fear. "I heard it. It was in my head." "It wasn't you." I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. But I couldn't. The voice was still there, echoing in the back of my mind. A warning. And then the lights flickered back on. The machine started again. The gears turned. The hum resumed. But this time, there was something different. Something more sinister. The door to the room slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the air growing thick and oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the hum, the voice. And then, as if on cue, the shadows in the room shifted. Something was moving. The figure in the corner wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. The shadows clung to it, distorting its shape, making it look like a twisted version of a person, a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. My heart raced in my chest, and for a moment, I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Ben, standing beside me, was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What? What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical hum. I swallowed, unable to find my voice. But I could feel it, a presence that wasn't just watching us, it was waiting. It was studying us, calculating. And for the first time in my life, I knew what real terror felt like. It wasn't the immediate danger of being attacked. It was the way the air itself seemed to acknowledge our fear, the way it grew thicker and heavier as we stood there. I took a step back, trying to put distance between us and the creature. Ben did the same, but there was no place to hide. The walls were bare and cold, the room too small to escape. We were trapped, cornered. And then it moved. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows, a subtle change, like a ripple in the dark. But then, the figure stepped forward. The sound it made was like the creaking of old wood, but louder, sharper, like a scream caught in a throat that couldn't scream. It stepped closer, its long limbs swaying unnaturally. its body contorting as it moved. Its face, or what should have been a face, was barely visible in the dim light, but I could see its eyes. Black, hollow, empty. And then it spoke. The voice that came from it wasn't human either. It was distorted, stretched, like something trying to form words, but unable to quite get it right. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped, its voice like nails scraping against metal. "You are not welcome." Then the figure lunged. It wasn't a normal lunge. It wasn't a leap or a sudden movement. It was fluid, like it was part of the shadows themselves, flowing toward us in a way that defied all laws of nature. Ben stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the cold concrete floor. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth opening in a silent scream. I reached out to grab him, to pull him back, but it was too late. The creature's hand, if you could even call it a hand, shot out and grabbed Ben by the throat. Its fingers were long, too long, the nails like claws digging into his skin. Ben choked, his eyes bulging in terror as the creature lifted him off the ground with ease. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum that got louder and louder until I thought my head might explode. I had to do something. I had to save him. But I couldn't. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place by an invisible force. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the creature held Ben suspended in midair, its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, locked on mine. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, its voice harsh whisper. "You have no idea what you've awakened." I could hear Ben gasping for breath, his hands clawing at the creature's fingers, but it was futile. The creature's grip tightened, its eyes burning with a cold, unfeeling rage. And then, without warning, the creature flung Ben across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud, his body crumpling to the floor like a ragdoll. I heard him groan, but it was clear that he wasn't getting up. He was unconscious, or worse. I didn't know what to do. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't break free from the creature's gaze. It was like it was controlling me, pulling me into its void. The creature tilted its head, as if considering me, studying me like an insect under a magnifying glass. I could feel my body shaking, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this. But there was nothing. No escape. No way to fight back. Then, without warning, the figure moved closer. I could feel the cold emanating from it, the chilling presence wrapping around me like a thick fog. It reached out, its fingers long and twisted, and for a moment I thought it was going to touch me. I couldn't let it touch me, but before I could even react, a loud crash echoed through the factory. The lights flickered, and the humming of the machine abruptly stopped. The creature paused, its head snapping toward the source of the sound. I saw my chance. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could hear the creature moving behind me, its footsteps impossibly fast, like the sound of claws scraping against the concrete. But I kept running, my legs burning, my breath ragged. I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I reached the door. It was still locked, but I didn't care. I slammed my body against it, and to my surprise, it gave way. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air rushing over me. The factory stood behind me, silent once again, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me from the darkness. I could feel its presence, lingering, waiting. The night air felt colder than it should have been, biting at my skin as I watched Ben struggle to sit up. He looked disoriented, his eyes blinking in the dim light as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. I felt a rush of relief knowing he was still alive, but the terror I just witnessed didn't fade. It clung to me, lingering in every breath I took. I reached out to help him, my hands shaking as I gripped his arm, pulling him to his feet. His body was weak, his movements slow, but he was coherent. We didn't exchange many words, neither of us knowing what to say. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, his face pale and drawn. What happened? he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't know how to explain it. How could I? How could I possibly describe the creature, the way it moved and spoke, the sheer terror it invoked in every fiber of my being? I don't know, I replied, my voice quiet, as if saying it out loud might make it all the more real. But I don't think it's over. I don't think we've seen the last of it. Ben nodded slowly, his eyes still wide, as though he couldn't shake the image of the thing he had seen. Neither could I. I could still feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, the cold, suffocating presence that had followed us out of the factory. We didn't talk much more as we made our way back to the car. The drive back was silent, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires on the road. Every now and then, I would glance at Ben, but he was staring straight ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Neither of us had the energy to speak. When we finally reached my apartment, we didn't go inside immediately. Instead, we sat in the car for a few minutes, both of us processing the events of the night. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion that followed a fight for survival. I don't know what to do, Ben said after a long pause, his voice shaky. It's not over, is it? The thing. It's still out there. I swallowed hard, the cold, harsh reality of the situation setting in. I wanted to deny it, to say it was over, that we had escaped, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That thing, whatever it was still out there. And it wasn't just hunting us. It was waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for us to slip up. We don't know what it is, I said, my voice low and uncertain. We don't know if it's still alive, or if it's following us, or if we're just marked. But I can't go back there. I can't go near that place again. Ben nodded, though his expression was one of uncertainty. We need to tell someone, he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. Tell the police, get them to investigate. We can't just leave it like this. I stared at him, a wave of frustration rising in my chest. What are we supposed to tell them? That we saw some monster in an abandoned factory? They'll think we're crazy. Ben fell silent, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. We both knew there was no way to explain what had happened, not in a way that anyone would believe. It wasn't like a normal ghost story or a typical haunting. This was something else entirely, something that didn't fit the rules of reality. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. But they wouldn't go away. The image of that creature, its hollow eyes, its twisted limbs, it was burned into my memory, and I couldn't escape it. I'm not going back, I said firmly. We don't go back to that factory. It's over. Whatever happens next, we deal with it. Ben didn't argue, though I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. What if it follows us? What if it comes for us again? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was going to be okay, but I didn't believe it. Not anymore. The thing we had encountered was not something that could just be shrugged off. It was beyond our understanding, something that had existed long before we ever set foot in that factory. And now that it had seen us, I didn't think it would let us go so easily. Let's just stay away from the factory, I said, my voice hard with determination. We'll put as much distance between us and it as we can. Maybe that's enough. We sat in silence for a while longer, neither of us knowing what to say or do. Eventually, Ben got out of the car, offering me a half-hearted wave before heading inside his own apartment. I sat there for a while longer, staring at the dark, empty streets. My mind kept returning to that factory, to the creature we had encountered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. We hadn't defeated it. We had only managed to survive. For now. Days passed, and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. But the unease lingered. It was always there, in the back of my mind. I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, glancing nervously into darkened corners, as if expecting to see that thing lurking just out of sight. Ben and I avoided talking about it. We didn't mention the factory, or the creature, or what had happened that night. It was like some unspoken rule between us, an agreement to pretend it hadn't happened. But we both knew the truth. The thing we had encountered wasn't gone. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting. At least, that's what I told myself. I went through the motions of my daily life, returning to work, socializing with friends, and trying to convince myself that everything was normal. But it never quite felt the same. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of a street lamp, everything seemed to remind me of that night, of the dark entity we had barely escaped. I couldn't stop thinking about the factory. It was like a ghost in my mind, something that wouldn't leave, no matter how much I tried to move on. I started to feel like I was losing control of my own thoughts, constantly wondering if someone was watching me, waiting. Ben called me once, a few weeks after everything happened. His voice was shaky, uncertain, and he didn't say much. He just asked if I'd seen anything strange since the night we left the factory. I told him no, that everything was fine, that I hadn't heard anything or felt anything unusual. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I didn't tell him the truth. I hadn't gone back to the factory, and I hadn't seen anything, but there were times, late at night, when I could feel its presence, like a dark shadow, hovering just beyond my reach. We both agreed it was best to leave it behind, that we would move on with our lives, put it out of our minds. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore, one thought that haunted me. The feeling that whatever that creature was, it wasn't gone. It wasn't finished with us. I had an unsettling conviction that, sooner or later, we would cross paths again. That thought made my stomach churn. I couldn't understand why it lingered, why I couldn't shake the certainty that the factory hadn't been the end. Perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was something I couldn't explain, something that defied logic, something that clung to the edges of my reality like a fog I couldn't push away. A few months passed, and the world outside seemed to move on. I still worked the same job, drove the same route, lived in the same apartment. It was easy to forget, or at least to try. I kept my distance from Ben, sensing that we were both avoiding the topic. But the truth was that I felt a deep disconnect from everything around me. The joy I once felt in the simplest of things, walking in the park, grabbing coffee with friends, had faded. Life had become a series of mechanical actions, a performance I had to put on to appear normal. I would have moments when I'd forget, when I'd allow myself to feel at ease. But they were brief. The fear, the anxiety, it was always there, just beneath the surface. I began to wonder if I was slowly losing my mind. Maybe what had happened at the factory had left a mark on me, a permanent scar on my psyche. Perhaps it had changed something inside me, and I just hadn't realized it yet. I had survived, yes, but I wasn't sure I could ever be the same again. One evening, as I was walking home from work, something caught my attention. A flicker of movement in the distance, a shadow at the edge of my peripheral vision. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing, and scanned the street. Nothing. No one. It was a quiet evening, the streets empty except for a few cars passing by. But the sensation lingered, that prickling feeling at the back of my neck, the inexplicable sense that I was being watched. I hurried the rest of the way home, trying to push the unease aside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was someone out there. I could feel it. It wasn't just the factory that haunted me. It was the feeling of being pursued, of being hunted by something I couldn't explain. Something ancient. Something patient. A few nights later, as I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the restless thoughts swirling in my mind, I heard it. The sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was the same sound I had heard in the factory, that low mechanical hum that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my blood running cold. I listened harder, straining to hear it more clearly. There it was again, unmistakable. It was distant, as if coming from far away, but it was real. I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it just like before. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew, deep down, that it had found me. That thing, whatever it was still out there. It was close. I didn't get out of bed that night. I couldn't. I stayed there, wide-eyed, staring at the shadows in the corner of my room, waiting for something to happen, for that presence to make itself known. But nothing came. The sound faded, and I was left in silence once again. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a bad dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by stress and anxiety. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling, the nagging sense that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I didn't talk to Ben after that night. I didn't want to burden him with my fears, with a strange sense of doom that seemed to hang over me. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, to continue my life as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The truth was, I didn't know what I was running from, and I didn't know if I could keep running forever. As the years went by, I kept waiting for the inevitable, the moment when it would come for me again, when I would once more be forced to face whatever that creature was. It never did. I grew older, moved on with my life, and eventually found peace, at least on the surface. But there are nights when the wind is just right and the moonlight casts long shadows on the ground that I still hear it. That same hum, the same mechanical, otherworldly sound that fills the air and sends chills down my spine. And I know, in the quiet of those nights, that whatever happened at that factory is far from over.